The courtroom was cold and sterile, the air thick with tension. Spectators sat in stiff chairs, their eyes locked on the front of the room, waiting for something, anything, to break the silence. It wasn't just any case. This was high profile, the kind of case that made headlines, that kept TV anchors busy for weeks, and this time, it wasn't about politicians or celebrities. This time, it was Clint Eastwood, the Hollywood legend, the man whose rugged face and gravelly voice had defined decades of American film. As the clock on the wall ticked down, the door to the courtroom swung open. The murmurs around the room grew louder, whispers spreading like wildfire. Clint Eastwood had just entered. But he wasn't here as a movie star. He was here as a defendant, or more accurately, as a man looking for justice. Clint stood tall, his signature stern expression matching the one he wore on screen. At 65, he wasn't the same young man who had driven across the Wild West, but the presence he carried was undeniable. He took slow, measured steps toward the defense table, his eyes scanning the room for the key players, lawyers, journalists, and of course, the judge. Judge Thomas Reynolds, a man with a reputation as sharp as a tack, sat high on the bench, his steely eyes glimmering with a mix of contempt and curiosity. He had heard of Clint Eastwood, of course, but the Hollywood legend was just that, legendary. What was he doing here, in a real court of law, with the weight of corporate fraud hanging over his head? "You must be joking," Judge Reynolds muttered under his breath, just loud enough for Clint to hear. A smirk spread across his lips as he glanced over his papers, then looked down at Clint with a mocking gaze. "What are we doing here, Mr. Eastwood? Should I start expecting you to pull out a six-shooter and clean up the mess?" The room fell silent. No one dared to breathe. Clint's face remained unreadable, a stone mask that gave nothing away. He could feel the sting of the judge's words, but it was nothing new. He had faced more than his fair share of mockery in his life. This was just another round. The judge's words were meant to belittle him, to remind Clint that he was just another celebrity in the courtroom, nothing more than a pawn in a game that didn't belong to him. And yet, Clint Eastwood had always been a man of principle. He wasn't here for fame. He wasn't here for redemption. He was here because something far bigger than Hollywood glitz and glamour was at stake: justice. As the judge continued to rattle off the formalities of the case, Clint's mind wandered briefly. He had spent years in the public eye, playing the tough guy, the antihero, the man who always knew how to take down the bad guys. But real life was never so black and white, especially not in the world of law. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. The voice of the courtroom announcer cracked through Clint's thoughts, reminding him of the ever-present media circus. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough? A rhetorical question aimed at the unseen viewers, but one that Clint would take to heart. Clint's mind snapped back into focus as the judge banged his gavel, signaling the start of proceedings. He had no time to entertain doubts, no time for distractions. This was bigger than him. This was about more than just proving a point. This was about uncovering the truth. The case he was involved in wasn't a simple one. It was a tangled web of corporate corruption and financial fraud that reached far beyond what anyone could have imagined. Clint had gotten involved in this case through a series of events that seemed random at first, but now they were beginning to feel like fate. He wasn't just defending a company or a person. He was defending the principle of justice itself. The judge began reading out the details of the case, listing the allegations against the company Clint had once been associated with. The accusations were severe: billions in misappropriated funds, tax evasion, bribery, and other high-stakes crimes. Clint was here because he had been a part of the company's executive board, but he had always been more of a figurehead. He hadn't been involved in the shady dealings, at least, not directly. But the media had made him the face of the scandal. They loved the idea of Clint Eastwood, the tough, no-nonsense star, getting caught in a legal web. They loved the drama of it all. The tabloids had printed rumors, speculations, and leaks about his involvement, painting him as a guilty man before he even had a chance to speak for himself. Clint sat quietly, his mind racing as he processed the situation. He wasn't just a defendant here. No, he was a symbol now. A symbol of how the justice system could be twisted by the media, the public, and even those in power. And that's why he was going to fight. because if he didn't, no one would. "You're looking mighty comfortable there, Mr. Eastwood," the judge's voice rang out, breaking Clint's concentration once more. "Careful now, or I might start thinking you're plotting a Western showdown." The courtroom erupted in laughter, and Clint allowed himself a moment to absorb the sting of the judge's words. It wasn't about the mockery. It was about the message behind it. But Clint wasn't the kind of man to back down. He had faced worse than this in his life, far worse. And if there was one thing Clint Eastwood knew how to do, it was stare down a challenge. Just as the judge prepared to proceed, Clint stood up, his tall frame casting a long shadow in the dimly lit courtroom. The room fell silent, and for a brief moment, everyone was reminded that Clint Eastwood wasn't just some Hollywood actor. He was a man with a purpose. "Your Honor," Clint began, his voice calm but firm, "I didn't come here to play games. I came here for one reason, to find the truth. You can mock me all you want, but when this is over, it'll be the truth that stands. Not Hollywood. Not your jokes. The truth." The judge's smirk faltered, his eyes narrowing. The spectators seemed to hold their breath. Clint's words weren't just a response. They were a promise. A promise to uncover the truth, no matter what. As Clint sat back down, the room was charged with an energy that hadn't been there before. The judge was no longer laughing. The mockery had stopped, but one thing was clear. Clint Eastwood wasn't going to back down. He wasn't here to play a role. He was here to win. The trial had only just begun, but already, the stage had been set. No one in that courtroom knew it yet, but Clint Eastwood was about to change everything. And no one, not even Judge Thomas Reynolds, would ever look at him the same way again. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough? The courtroom had settled into a heavy silence, but Clint Eastwood's mind wasn't on the proceedings. Instead, his thoughts took him back in time, back to a world far different from the high-powered legal battle unfolding before him. He had always been the man with the camera, the tough guy, the one who could take on any villain. But Clint Eastwood was more than just the characters he portrayed on screen. He was a product of his past, a past that shaped everything he was today. Clint was born on May 31st, 1930, in San Francisco, California. Raised in the working-class neighborhoods of Oakland, he didn't have the silver spoon that many of his Hollywood peers were accustomed to. His father, a factory worker, was a man of few words but high expectations. Clint's mother, a homemaker, had a fierce sense of determination that she instilled in him. They weren't rich, but they made do, living a life that was grounded in hard work, honesty, and resilience. Those values would define Clint for the rest of his life. Growing up, Clint wasn't the most studious kid. In fact, he was often getting into trouble that often led to him finding solace in solitary activities like swimming or working odd jobs around town. He wasn't an athlete, but he had a certain ruggedness about him, something that set him apart from his peers. His childhood wasn't glamorous. It was full of ups and downs, but through it all, Clint remained steadfast. By the time Clint graduated high school, his ambition had grown. But college wasn't in the cards for him. Instead, he enlisted in the U.S. Army, serving as a lifeguard during the Korean War. His time in the military wasn't glamorous either, but it gave him something he'd never had before: structure. It was here that Clint learned the value of discipline and the importance of working under pressure, skills that would serve him well in the years to come. When Clint left the Army, he returned to California, unsure of what his next move would be. He dabbled in a variety of odd jobs before landing an acting gig on a small television show, Rawhide. He was just one of many unknown actors looking for their big break. But it wasn't long before Clint's rugged looks and deep voice caught the eye of Hollywood. He was cast in several films, but it was his role as the man with no name in Sergio Leone's Dollars trilogy that would change everything. Clint became a household name, the quintessential Western hero, a character that embodied the strong, silent type. But even as fame took over, Clint remained grounded. He didn't get swept up in the glitz and glamour of Hollywood's social scene. Instead, he focused on his craft, becoming a director and producer when many others were content to rest on their laurels. He never took the easy route, always pushing himself to do something more, something deeper. It was his relentless drive for excellence that separated him from the pack and made him a living legend. But while Clint found success on screen, the real story lay in the quiet moments. It was in the years of hard work and the relationships he built with those around him. Despite being known for playing the strong, unflappable character, Clint had his struggles. He had been married twice, and his personal life, like many Hollywood stars, was complicated. His first marriage to Maggie Johnson had ended in divorce, but they had 2 children together, Kyle and Allison. Later, he had a long-term relationship with actress Sandra Locke, which also ended amid public scandal. Yet through it all, Clint had remained a man of his word. He had always done his best by his family, even when the world watched him with a critical eye. But Clint's most personal connection, the one that had always been closest to his heart, was his love for his children. After his divorce from Maggie, Clint had been involved in a lengthy custody battle for his children, a fight that consumed him emotionally. The process had taught him more about the law than he had ever expected. It was a sobering experience that made him rethink the way he approached life, and it ignited a new passion within him, the desire to understand the justice system. This desire to understand the law led Clint down a surprising path. While many in Hollywood were content with their fame, Clint wanted more. He didn't just want to be a figurehead in the world of entertainment. He wanted to make a real difference. And so, in the years following his success as an actor and director, Clint began to study law. He devoured legal texts and case law, learning the nuances of the judicial system. He didn't attend a formal law school, but he didn't need to. His mind was sharp, and his determination was unmatched. Clint Eastwood was no longer just a Western hero or a Hollywood director. He was becoming something more. In the courtroom, he was a man who had lived through hardship, who had faced personal demons and come out the other side. His legal education, though unconventional, was rooted in his desire to understand justice and to fight for those who couldn't fight for themselves. This wasn't about ego. This wasn't about fame. It was about doing what was right. And now, in this courtroom, Clint Eastwood was about to show everyone exactly what that meant. As the trial went on, Clint's presence in the room was undeniable. His voice, calm but unwavering, carried the weight of a man who had faced countless challenges in his life. The judge, who had once mocked him, was now beginning to see Clint in a different light. He wasn't just a movie star playing a role. He was a man with real knowledge, with a sharp mind, and with a passion for justice that couldn't be ignored. But Clint wasn't just doing this for the satisfaction of proving his worth. There was something bigger at play. The case wasn't just about him. It was about exposing the truth. It was about holding people accountable for their actions and making sure that the system worked for everyone, not just the powerful few. And as Clint sat there, waiting for the next phase of the trial to begin, he knew one thing for sure. No matter what happened in that courtroom, this was just the beginning of something much bigger than any movie or fame could ever offer. The tension in the courtroom continued to build as Clint Eastwood sat quietly, waiting for the next phase of the trial. The judge, who had initially underestimated him, had begun to treat him with a bit more respect. The media, of course, had their eyes glued to Clint, but as the legal battle raged on, it became clear that this wasn't just another celebrity scandal. This was a fight for something much more significant, a fight for the truth. Behind the scenes, Clint wasn't alone. There were allies in the shadows, people who had quietly been working with him, helping him build his case, gathering evidence, and preparing for the inevitable showdown that would come once the jury was seated. These were not the kind of people you'd see on a movie set or read about in the tabloids. They were quiet professionals, skilled in their own right, and each one played a vital role in Clint's mission to expose the corruption that had engulfed the company he had once been associated with. Clint's lead attorney, a sharp-minded woman named Allison Hayes, had been his guiding force through this legal labyrinth. She wasn't fazed by the pressure of dealing with a high-profile client like Clint. In fact, she thrived under pressure. Allison had spent years working on corporate fraud cases, but this was the biggest case of her career. She had been the one to convince Clint that he needed to take this fight to court, not just for his reputation, but for the many others who had been hurt by the scandal. "Clint, the truth is on our side. We have to stay focused," Allison had told him on the eve of the trial. "This case is about more than you or me. It's about holding people accountable. We can't let the media or anyone else distract us." Her words had struck a chord with Clint. She was the voice of reason in the chaos, a stark contrast to the fiery personality he'd grown used to on set. He respected her determination and knew that with her by his side, they had a shot at winning this. But there were others, too. People who didn't appear in the public eye but whose work was quietly shaping the case. One of them was Nathan Brooks, a private investigator who had been digging into the financials of the company Clint had been affiliated with. Nathan was no stranger to the murky world of corporate corruption. He had spent years tracking down white-collar criminals and exposing their lies. He had been the one to uncover key documents that showed the company had been funneling money through a network of shell companies, using Clint's name and reputation to avoid scrutiny. Nathan had been careful, working under the radar, ensuring that no one connected the dots back to Clint. It was a dangerous game, but Clint knew it was necessary. Nathan's work was crucial to their defense, and Clint could feel the weight of what they were about to reveal. Every time they uncovered another piece of evidence, the case against the company grew stronger. Then there was Marie Thompson, an expert witness in corporate law. Marie had been called in to dissect the financial irregularities in the company's accounts. She was known for her sharp analytical skills and her ability to make complex legal jargon accessible. Marie had been the one to identify the specific loopholes the company had exploited and how Clint's role, although limited, had been manipulated to cover up the fraudulent activity. Together, these allies formed a formidable team, and Clint trusted them all implicitly. They were the ones who had helped him prepare for this moment, when everything would come to a head in front of a jury. And though the world outside the courtroom saw Clint as just another celebrity caught in a scandal, the truth was that he had surrounded himself with some of the most brilliant minds in the legal field. People who were willing to fight for what was right, regardless of the stakes. In the days that followed, Clint's legal team worked tirelessly behind the scenes. Allison and Nathan coordinated with witnesses, cross-checking every piece of evidence to ensure nothing slipped through the cracks. Marie was putting the final touches on her expert testimony, preparing for the day when she would be called to the stand to deliver the devastating truth about the company's fraudulent activities. Meanwhile, the courtroom drama played out in front of the jury, who were completely unaware of the intricate web of lies that had been woven around Clint. The defense strategy was clear: to shift the focus from Clint's personal involvement to the overarching corruption within the company. The goal was to show that Clint had been a victim of a much larger scheme, a scheme orchestrated by people who had used his name and fame to cover their tracks. But Clint knew better than anyone that the truth was never as simple as it seemed. There would be no easy way out. The media would twist every word. The judge would be swayed by his reputation, and the public would be quick to judge. In the end, the battle would be won or lost based on what happened inside the courtroom. The presentation of facts, the strategies of the legal teams, and the ability to prove, beyond a reasonable doubt, that Clint Eastwood was not the villain the media had painted him to be. As the trial entered its second week, Clint found himself increasingly aware of the psychological toll the case was taking on him. He was no stranger to pressure. He had faced it countless times in his career. But this was different. This was real. This was his reputation, his name, and his life on the line. No amount of Hollywood fame could prepare him for the intensity of the courtroom. It wasn't just the legal battle that weighed on him. Clint had been reflecting on his personal journey, the choices he had made, and the people he had trusted along the way. His heart ached for his children, who had been dragged into the media circus. He hated the thought of them seeing him as a villain in the eyes of the world. But Clint wasn't the kind of man to give up. No matter what, he had made a promise to himself and his loved ones. He was going to see this through to the end, and he wasn't going to back down. He would fight for justice, not just for himself, but for everyone who had been hurt by the greed and corruption of those in power. The battle was just beginning, but Clint Eastwood was ready for whatever came next. He wasn't alone. He had a team of fierce allies by his side, each one working tirelessly to ensure the truth was revealed. And no matter how difficult the fight, Clint knew that the truth would ultimately prevail. As Clint sat at the defense table, he could feel the weight of the world on his shoulders. The once bustling courtroom had fallen into an eerie silence, save for the rhythmic tapping of the court clerk's pen as she recorded every word spoken. The tension was palpable. Every eye in the room was on him. From the judge on the bench to the jurors sitting with rapt attention, to the media crew in the back of the room capturing every moment. The prosecution's case had been a meticulous series of attacks, each one designed to paint Clint as an unwitting accomplice in the fraudulent dealings of a massive corporation. The media had already begun running sensational stories that further tarnished his image. They wanted to believe the worst about Clint Eastwood, the man who had lived his life on his own terms, who had always been the tough, unyielding hero. But Clint knew the truth, and as the defense team prepared to take their turn, he felt a quiet resolve settle over him. This wasn't just about defending himself. It was about fighting for the justice he had spent so many years learning about holding those who had wronged him accountable. This was no longer just a battle for his reputation. It was a battle for integrity. "All rise," the bailiff's voice echoed through the room, and everyone stood as Judge Daniels entered the courtroom. Clint did the same, straightening his jacket as he prepared for what was about to unfold. "Be seated," the judge commanded, and everyone quickly resumed their positions. Clint, along with Allison and their team, settled in at the defense table, ready to face the prosecution's next move. The defense's turn was up. Allison stood and adjusted her glasses, walking confidently toward the jury box. She turned to face the jury, her voice calm but assertive. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, we are here today because of a lie. A lie that has been perpetuated not only by the media but by the very people who have exploited Clint Eastwood's name for their own financial gain. It is crucial that we understand one thing. Clint was not a part of this conspiracy. He was a victim of it." She paused, letting the words hang in the air. The jury's eyes followed her every move. Clint couldn't help but admire Allison's poise. She had a way of making even the most complicated legal arguments sound simple, as though she was speaking directly to each person in the room, as if they were her only concern. "All evidence presented thus far has been circumstantial, designed to mislead you into believing that Clint Eastwood was anything but a pawn in a much larger game. We will show you, beyond any reasonable doubt, that Clint had no involvement in the illegal activities of the company he once worked with. In fact, it was Clint who unknowingly provided the perfect cover for those who profited from his reputation." Clint's heart raced as Allison continued. She spoke with the confidence of someone who knew exactly what she was doing, but there was no denying the pressure that was building in the room. With each word, she was setting the stage for a showdown that could change everything. The courtroom doors opened, and Nathan Brooks, the private investigator, entered. He was a no-nonsense man with a sharp mind and a quiet demeanor, and as he made his way to the witness stand, Clint couldn't help but feel a surge of hope. Nathan had been the one to uncover the paper trail, the emails, the financial records, the hidden accounts that connected the company's executives to the fraudulent activities that had been sweeping under the radar for years. Now, he was ready to tell his story. "Mr. Brooks, please state your name and occupation for the court," Allison said as she stood beside him. "My name is Nathan Brooks. I'm a private investigator specializing in corporate fraud and white-collar crime," Nathan replied, his voice steady. "All right, Mr. Brooks. Can you tell the court what your investigation revealed regarding the financial activities of the company in question?" Nathan nodded, shifting slightly in his seat as he addressed the jury. "I was hired to investigate the financial records of this company due to concerns about discrepancies in their reports. What I discovered was far more than I expected. There were multiple instances of embezzlement, fraudulent transactions, and a network of shell companies designed to conceal the illegal movement of funds. These actions were not just illegal, they were designed to cover up the true scope of the scheme." Allison motioned to a large board that had been set up in front of the jury box. It displayed charts, emails, and other key pieces of evidence that Nathan had uncovered. He pointed to a set of emails that had been exchanged between the company's executives, implicating them in the plot to mislead investors and the public. These communications, which were obtained through legal means, show that the executives were fully aware of the company's illegal activities and were working tirelessly to keep Clint Eastwood's name attached to the company in order to shield themselves from public scrutiny. Clint had no idea. He was used, manipulated, and taken advantage of. The room was quiet. Clint's chest tightened as he listened to Nathan's testimony. It was a relief to hear the truth being spoken so clearly, but there was still a sense of unease in the air. Would the jury believe them? Would they see Clint as the victim or the perpetrator? The prosecution's turn came soon after, and the tension in the courtroom reached a fever pitch. The prosecutor, a seasoned attorney named Richard Simmons, was known for his fiery demeanor. He had been relentless in his attacks on Clint, and he wasn't about to back down now. "Mr. Brooks, do you have any evidence that directly connects Mr. Eastwood to these fraudulent activities?" Richard's voice was sharp as he rose to cross-examine the witness. Nathan took a moment before responding. "No, Mr. Simmons. There is no evidence that links Mr. Eastwood to the fraudulent activities. He was not involved in any of the decisions or actions that were taken. He was simply the face of a much larger operation that he knew nothing about." The prosecutor scoffed, turning to the jury with an incredulous expression. "So, you expect this jury to believe that a man like Clint Eastwood, a Hollywood legend, didn't know what was going on with the company he was associated with? This man was no innocent bystander. He was a pawn in a carefully crafted scheme, and it's time for him to answer for it." The courtroom erupted into murmurs, but Judge Daniels quickly called for order. "Mr. Simmons, please refrain from making assumptions. Stick to the facts," the judge warned. Clint felt a surge of anger, but he kept his composure. This was only the beginning of the fight. It wasn't over yet. As the day wore on, Clint could feel the weight of the case growing heavier. Each word, each piece of evidence, was building toward the final confrontation. But Clint knew that they had one thing the prosecution didn't: the truth, and he was ready to make sure the jury heard it loud and clear. The courtroom buzzed with the sound of quiet whispers as the defense continued to unravel the lies that had been woven around Clint Eastwood's name. It had been a long day, and the tension had begun to wear on everyone. The hours of relentless questioning, the constant back and forth between the defense and prosecution, had created an atmosphere thick with anticipation. But Clint knew that the most crucial moment of the trial was still to come. As the day turned into evening, the prosecution's case started to show cracks. The attacks on Clint's character, the insinuations of his involvement in the fraudulent activities, had started to feel hollow. The more the defense team worked, the more the truth became evident. But the final nail in the coffin, the one thing that would tip the scales in their favor, hadn't come yet. It was time for Marie Thompson, the expert witness in corporate law, to take the stand. Allison stood and addressed the court, her voice steady and confident. "Your Honor, we call Marie Thompson to the stand." The room fell silent as Marie, a sharp and meticulous corporate law expert, made her way to the witness stand. She was an unassuming woman in her late 40s, with dark glasses perched on her nose and a calm demeanor that suggested she had seen it all. Her presence was commanding, however, and it was clear that her testimony would be crucial in shifting the narrative. "Ms. Thompson, can you please explain to the jury the findings of your investigation into the company's financial records?" Allison asked, motioning for her to begin. Marie adjusted her glasses and leaned forward slightly, her voice clear and authoritative as she began to speak. "I was asked to analyze the financial statements of the company associated with Clint Eastwood to determine if there were any irregularities. What I found was not just a series of errors or lapses. It was a well-orchestrated fraud that spanned years. There were false transactions, fabricated invoices, and millions of dollars funneled through a network of shell companies designed to cover up the illicit activities of the company's executives." Marie paused, her words hanging in the air as the jurors leaned forward, listening intently. What's more, Clint Eastwood's name was used as a shield. His involvement was purely superficial. He was used as a figurehead, a well-known name to lend credibility to the company. He had no knowledge of the financial dealings or the fraudulent practices being carried out behind the scenes. In fact, it was the company executives who intentionally kept him in the dark. The room was still. Clint felt his heart race as the truth came to light. Marie's words were like a balm to the raw wounds that had been opened during the trial. He had spent so much time fighting the accusations, enduring the public scrutiny, and now, finally, the truth was being spoken by someone who had no personal stake in the matter. Marie's testimony was a turning point. She wasn't just a witness. She was the key that unlocked the door to the truth. But, Marie continued, the company executives used Clint Eastwood's reputation, his fame, and his association with their brand to further their own agenda. They needed someone with credibility, someone the public trusted. And Clint, unknowingly, became that person. He was used as a tool to hide their crimes, and they knew that the longer they kept him on board, the more they could avoid scrutiny. It was a deliberate decision on their part to exploit his name for their own benefit. The prosecutor, Richard Simmons, stood up immediately, ready to challenge Marie's testimony. Objection, Your Honor. This is pure speculation. There is no concrete evidence to back up these claims. Judge Daniels looked at Simmons with a stern gaze. Sustained. Ms. Thompson, please stick to the evidence you've uncovered. Marie nodded, unflinching. She had expected the objection, and it didn't faze her. She knew she had the facts on her side. I understand, Your Honor, Marie said. Let me be clear. The evidence I provided shows that Clint Eastwood's association with the company was not based on his knowledge or involvement in the financial activities. His name was strategically used to lend credibility to the company, but he was kept in the dark about the illegal actions occurring behind the scenes. Allison looked toward Clint, her eyes meeting his with a nod of reassurance. The tension in Clint's chest began to ease. The pieces were falling into place. It was clear now that the defense was gaining ground, and the prosecution's case was starting to lose its grip on the jury. The truth was coming to light, and it was more powerful than any media narrative or legal strategy. But even with the truth on their side, there was still the looming challenge of the emotional toll this trial had taken on Clint. The constant scrutiny, the public judgment, it weighed heavily on him. As much as he tried to keep his composure, the emotional burden of the case had begun to chip away at him. That evening, as Clint sat alone in his dressing room, he reflected on the personal cost of this battle. He had always been a private man, a man who valued his personal life and privacy above all else. But now, his life was an open book. The media had dissected every aspect of his past, from his relationships to his career. They had twisted the truth, fabricated stories, and turned his life into a spectacle. The stress was palpable, and Clint could feel the weariness in his bones. His thoughts were interrupted by a knock at the door. He turned to see Allison standing in the doorway, her face a mix of exhaustion and determination. Clint, we've made great progress today. You did well, she said, stepping into the room. But I know this has been hard on you. The emotional toll, it's not easy. I can't even imagine what you're going through. Clint sighed, rubbing his face with both hands. It's not just about the case, Allison. It's everything. The media, the public, the lies. It's all too much sometimes. Allison sat down next to him, her voice gentle. You've always been a fighter, Clint, and you're not alone in this. We've got the truth on our side, and we'll keep pushing forward. You've come too far to back down now. Clint looked at her, a faint smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. I'm not backing down, Allison. Not now. Not ever. And with that, he knew that no matter how hard the road ahead would be, he had found his strength again. The emotional pain, the public judgment, it was all just noise. The truth was more powerful than any of it, and he wasn't going to stop until it was heard. The following morning, the courtroom was filled with a new energy. The defense team had turned the tide. After Marie's testimony the day before, the once certain conviction of the prosecution now seemed like a distant dream. But Clint knew better than to let his guard down. The battle was far from over, and the final blow could come at any moment. The prosecution was going to retaliate. Clint's hands were still shaky as he adjusted his tie, but Allison's words echoed in his mind. You've come too far to back down now. That was the kind of motivation he needed, the kind of resolve that had defined his entire life. He had been through worse than this, countless battles in Hollywood, criticisms, judgments, and even losses. But this was different. This wasn't a role he was playing in front of a camera. This was his life. The courtroom was bustling with the usual flurry of activity. As jurors whispered among themselves, lawyers shuffled papers, and the audience murmured in anticipation. Clint caught the eye of a few familiar faces, reporters, a few of his old friends from Hollywood. But it was the strangers, the people who had never known him outside of the headlines, who weighed heavily on him. Mr. Eastwood, Allison said, interrupting his thoughts as she approached him with a stack of documents in her hand. I need you to stay focused. We're entering the home stretch, but the prosecution is going to hit us hard today. Clint nodded, his expression resolute. "I'm ready," he said, though inside, he wasn't sure if anyone could ever truly be ready for the kind of storm they were facing. Judge Daniels entered the courtroom, and once again, the room fell into complete silence. "All rise," the bailiff called out. The defense team stood, and Clint quickly adjusted his posture. He knew he had to keep his composure. He wasn't just representing himself in that moment. He was representing the truth, and the truth was something worth fighting for. As Judge Daniels took his seat, the proceedings began again. The prosecution wasted no time. Richard Simmons, the lead prosecutor, stood with his usual air of confidence. He had been a formidable opponent throughout the trial, but today, he seemed even more determined. Clint could tell that they were preparing for a counterattack. Simmons wasn't going to let go of his case without a fight. "Your Honor," Simmons began, "we've heard a great deal about Clint Eastwood's supposed innocence, but let's take a moment to reflect on the facts. The defendant was not simply a victim of this so-called corporate conspiracy. He was an integral part of it." Simmons walked across the courtroom, making eye contact with the jurors as he spoke, his tone laced with accusation. Clint Eastwood wasn't some unsuspecting pawn. He was the face of the company. His name was used in promotional materials, in interviews, and on press releases to keep the public in the dark about the shady dealings of the corporation. He knew what was going on. He just didn't care. Clint's chest tightened as the words hit him. There it was, the accusation that had haunted him since the beginning. The idea that he had somehow been complicit, that his fame had somehow played a role in this conspiracy. He wanted to stand up and yell that it wasn't true, but he held back. He knew he had to stay calm, to let the facts speak for themselves. "Mr. Eastwood," Simmons continued, his voice growing louder with each word, "you were not some innocent bystander. You were involved. The only question is, how deep did your involvement go?" Clint felt the eyes of everyone in the room on him, on his every move, on his every reaction. It was a feeling he was all too familiar with, but it never got easier. But then, something happened. It wasn't a dramatic moment, no big reveal or flash of insight. It was small, almost imperceptible at first. Clint, his heart racing, noticed the slightest shift in the mood of the room. The jury, who had been so engrossed in the prosecution's claims, seemed to be leaning in a bit. Some of them exchanged looks, slight nods, furrowed brows, quiet murmurs. It was Marie Thompson's testimony that had begun to take root in their minds. Slowly, like a subtle change in the air, the tide of the courtroom began to shift in the defense's favor. And that's when Clint made his move. With all eyes on him, Clint stood up, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. The murmurs in the room quieted immediately, and even Simmons seemed momentarily taken aback. Clint didn't wait for permission to speak. "I'm not going to sit here and let you turn my life into something it's not." Clint's voice rang out, steady and forceful, as he looked directly at the jury. "I didn't know what was happening. I didn't ask to be part of some corporate scheme. I was a figurehead, a name on a press release. I wasn't involved in any of the illegal activities the prosecution is trying to pin on me." He paused for a moment, letting his words hang in the air, before continuing. "What I am, though, is someone who's been fighting for what's right for a long time. I've spent my career standing up for justice. I don't need to be painted as a villain because that's not who I am. I'm not the bad guy here." The courtroom was silent as Clint spoke, his words cutting through the tension like a knife. He wasn't just defending himself against the charges. He was showing the jury who he really was. Not some fabricated character, but the Clint Eastwood they had seen on screen, the one who had spent his life fighting for truth and justice. Simmons opened his mouth to speak, but Clint wasn't finished yet. "I understand that the prosecution has a job to do," Clint said, his eyes never leaving Simmons. "But the truth matters. If you let them make me into a criminal based on assumptions and lies, then what does that say about the justice system?" The courtroom was still. For the first time in this trial, Clint had truly taken control. It wasn't the show of bravado he was known for. It was raw, unfiltered emotion. The truth was on his side, and he knew it. He had lived a life that wasn't perfect, but it was a life built on honesty and integrity. The jury's eyes were locked on him. He saw their expressions, some skeptical, some thoughtful, but they were listening now. For the first time, Clint allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, this battle wasn't lost after all. The air in the courtroom was thick with anticipation as Clint sat back down. He could feel the weight of the moment, the first time during this entire trial that he had truly taken charge of his own defense. His words had resonated, not just with the jury, but with everyone in the room. Even Simmons seemed a little rattled, though he quickly recovered his composure. Judge Daniels banged his gavel, calling for order. "Mr. Eastwood, while your statement is noted, I remind you that you are not to address the jury directly without following proper procedures. We will now continue." Clint nodded in acknowledgement, sitting quietly. But the damage was done. The emotional intensity of his words had planted a seed of doubt in the minds of the jurors. He could see it in their eyes. The skeptical ones were now leaning forward, their arms crossed, perhaps rethinking the case. The ones who had been in his corner were visibly more confident. It was a small victory, but it was significant. Allison leaned in, her voice low but urgent. "You did good, Clint. You really did." He gave her a small nod, though inside, he still felt the pressure. They weren't out of the woods yet. Not by a long shot. Simmons, clearly irritated, called his next witness to the stand. A man named Charles Griffin, a former business associate of Clint's, was called to testify. From the moment he stepped up to the stand, Clint felt an uneasy knot form in his stomach. He remembered Charles vaguely, a man he had worked with in the past, but someone Clint hadn't spoken to in years. Griffin looked polished, dressed in a suit that screamed corporate success, and his demeanor was one of someone with an agenda. Clint could already sense that this wasn't going to go smoothly. "Mr. Griffin," Simmons began, "can you tell us about your relationship with the defendant, Clint Eastwood, and the role he played in your dealings?" Griffin adjusted his glasses and leaned forward slightly. His gaze flickered briefly to Clint before focusing on the jury. "We worked together on several high-profile projects. Mr. Eastwood, as you know, is a well-known figure. His name alone was invaluable to the success of the company," Griffin began, his tone almost too practiced, as though he had rehearsed this. "But the truth is, Clint was more than just a name. He was directly involved in the decisions that were made. He may have not understood the full extent of the operations, but he knew enough." Clint's heart sank. This wasn't the man he remembered, a colleague, someone with whom he had shared casual meetings and business discussions. This was a man who had been turned into a tool of the prosecution. Allison's voice was a whisper beside him. "Don't let him get under your skin. We'll deal with this." But Clint couldn't help it. He had trusted Griffin in the past. Now, to hear his former associate turn against him, fabricating details and twisting the truth, was hard to stomach. "Mr. Griffin," Simmons continued, "isn't it true that Mr. Eastwood signed off on many of the major decisions that led to the company's success, including the partnerships with the offshore entities that are now at the center of this investigation?" Clint could feel the heat rising in his chest, but he held his ground. This was the moment when he had to stay calm. He couldn't let this lie go unchallenged. Griffin looked directly at the jury, his gaze filled with feigned sincerity. Yes, Clint was aware of some of the partnerships. It wasn't unusual for him to sign off on things. He didn't always ask for details, but he was involved. Clint knew that Simmons was trying to make him seem like an active participant in the illegal dealings. But this wasn't the truth, and he needed to expose that. The defense team's turn came quickly. Allison stood up, her voice calm and collected. "Mr. Griffin," she began, "you say that Clint Eastwood signed off on partnerships, but you also acknowledge that he didn't ask for details. Can you tell us why you believe he was involved in anything illegal?" Griffin shifted uncomfortably in his seat. The questions from the defense had clearly caught him off guard. "Look, he was the face of the company," Griffin replied, trying to maintain his composure. "People trusted him. His name was valuable." "So, to be clear," Allison pressed, "you're saying Clint Eastwood's involvement was merely symbolic. He didn't actively engage in any fraudulent activities, correct?" Griffin hesitated, his eyes darting back to Clint, then to the jury. I didn't say that exactly." Allison smiled, a small, knowing smile. "No, you didn't. Because you can't. The truth is, Mr. Griffin, You're here trying to shift the blame onto someone who had no knowledge of the crimes that were committed. The room was silent, and the shift in the atmosphere was palpable. Clint could feel it in his bones. For the first time in this trial, Griffin seemed like he was losing control of his narrative. Allison pressed on, "Mr. Griffin, would you like to clarify for the jury how it is that Clint Eastwood, an actor and producer, could have been deeply involved in a company's financial decisions without any knowledge of the specific transactions happening behind the scenes?" Griffin's face reddened, and for a moment, he was at a loss for words. The defense had struck at the heart of his testimony, and he couldn't recover. "No further questions," Allison said, sitting back down, her eyes never leaving Griffin. Clint watched as the prosecution's witness seemed to deflate in front of the jury. The doubt that had been building in the minds of the jurors now had a solid foundation. Griffin's credibility was in question, and it was clear to everyone in the room that he had not been entirely truthful. As the jury filed out for a short break, Clint leaned back in his chair, exhaling deeply. He glanced at Allison, who was already looking over her notes. "We've got them on the ropes," she said quietly, her voice filled with a quiet confidence. Clint didn't respond right away. He was still processing everything that had happened. The storm wasn't over, but it felt like they had turned a corner. For the first time in a long time, Clint allowed himself to believe that they had a real shot at winning this. He wasn't just fighting for his reputation anymore. He was fighting for something deeper: his integrity, his legacy, and the truth. And now, the truth was finally being heard. The break between sessions was brief, but it felt like an eternity to Clint. His mind raced as he pondered the implications of the day's events. The testimony of Charles Griffin had been a pivotal moment. The cracks in the prosecution's case were beginning to show, and Clint could sense that the tide was shifting. But there was still a long road ahead. The prosecution had one more card to play, and Clint knew that Simmons would bring out something brutal to counter the damage done by the defense. He didn't know what it would be, but the feeling of dread gnawed at him. When the jury filed back into the room, the energy shifted again. This wasn't just another day in court. It felt like the final act of a drama, where all the loose ends would either be tied up or unravel completely. Clint's throat tightened as the room settled, every eye on him. Judge Daniels banged the gavel, signaling the start of the next phase of the trial. "We are now at the stage where the prosecution will call its next witness," he said, his voice booming across the quiet room. "Mr. Simmons, please proceed." The prosecution's attorney stood up with a sense of finality, walking towards the stand with a folder in hand. He gave Clint a pointed glance before turning back to the jury. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," Simmons began, his voice smooth and controlled, "we've heard plenty of back and forth. We've seen some weak attempts to refute the facts. But now, it's time to hear from someone who has first-hand knowledge of Clint Eastwood's role in this entire operation." Clint's heart skipped a beat. First-hand knowledge? Who could he be talking about? Simmons motioned toward the door. "Please welcome Ms. Linda Roberts." Clint froze. Linda Roberts? He hadn't thought about her in years. Linda was someone from his past, someone he hadn't seen in a long time. She had been a business associate, one of the many people Clint had crossed paths with during his time in the entertainment industry. She wasn't someone Clint had ever trusted fully, but she was, at least, a part of his past. The door opened, and a tall, confident woman walked into the courtroom. She was impeccably dressed, her heels clicking sharply on the marble floor as she took her place at the witness stand. Clint's stomach twisted with unease. She had the look of someone who had come to settle an old score. Linda glanced over at Clint briefly before giving the jury a cool, calculated smile. It was a look that Clint remembered all too well, a look of someone who knew how to manipulate a situation to her advantage. Simmons moved closer to the stand. "Ms. Roberts, thank you for being here today. Could you please explain to the jury your relationship with Clint Eastwood?" Linda's eyes flickered to Clint before she addressed the jury with an air of professionalism. "I was a former executive at one of the companies Clint Eastwood was associated with during the early 2000s. I was also directly involved in several of the business ventures he was attached to," she began, her voice silky but cold. "I can testify that Mr. Eastwood had a significant role in the decision-making processes of these ventures." Clint's pulse quickened. This was worse than he had feared. Linda was now aligning herself with the prosecution, and her testimony would be difficult to refute. She was about to paint him as a far more active participant in these business dealings than he was. He could feel the weight of her words hanging over him as she spoke. "Ms. Roberts," Simmons continued, "could you elaborate on the specific role Mr. Eastwood played in these ventures?" Linda shifted slightly in her seat. Clint Eastwood's involvement was not just as a figurehead. While he may have been known for his acting career, behind the scenes, he was deeply embedded in the operations. He signed off on financial transactions, communicated regularly with our partners, and even attended high-stakes meetings where important decisions were made. Clint's mind raced. This was a bombshell. Linda was trying to make it seem like he was an active participant in everything that had gone wrong. But it wasn't true. He had been a name, a brand, but he hadn't been involved in the day-to-day operations. He hadn't been the one pulling the strings. Allison leaned toward him, her voice barely a whisper. "Stay calm. Let her talk. We'll dismantle this when it's our turn." Clint took a deep breath, focusing on her words. He couldn't let this woman twist the truth. He needed to stay sharp. Simmons continued, "And you're certain, Ms. Roberts, that Mr. Eastwood had full knowledge of the transactions and the dealings involved in the company?" Linda's gaze never wavered from Clint. "Absolutely. He was involved in every key decision. If there were fraudulent actions taking place, he had to have known about them." The courtroom was silent, but Clint could feel the heat rising inside him. He had been preparing for a moment like this, an attempt to tie him directly to the alleged crimes. But hearing it from Linda, someone from his past, someone who had been a part of the business dealings at the time, hit harder than he expected. His reputation was on the line. But there was one thing Clint knew for sure. He was not going to let her rewrite history. Simmons smiled, sensing the victory. "Thank you, Ms. Roberts. No further questions." Clint was up before anyone could blink, his chair scraping noisily across the floor. Judge Daniels looked up, his brow furrowing slightly. "Mr. Eastwood," the judge said, "I remind you that you are not to speak unless you are called to testify or ask questions." Clint held his hands up briefly. "Your Honor, I request permission to cross-examine this witness." There was a brief moment of hesitation, and then Daniels nodded. "Very well. You may proceed." Clint stood tall as he walked toward the stand. This was his moment. He had to take control of this situation. His life depended on it. "Ms. Roberts," Clint began, his voice calm but firm, "it's been a long time since we've had the chance to speak, but I have a few questions for you." Linda's gaze was unwavering, but Clint could see the tension building in her eyes. He was about to turn the tables. "During our time working together, you and I had many conversations about the operations of the company. But let's be clear, I was not involved in the day-to-day business dealings. My role was to be a public face. You knew that." "We both knew that," Clint said, his tone steady and direct. Linda didn't respond immediately, but Clint could see the crack in her composure. She had expected him to remain silent, to let her narrative stand uncontested. But now, with Clint speaking directly to her, the dynamic had shifted. "I've been in this business for a long time," Clint continued, "and I've learned one thing. There are people who will use your name for their own gain. I was never one of those people, and I'm not going to let you turn me into one." The courtroom was holding its breath. Clint had just delivered a punch to Linda's testimony, and it had landed. The jury was watching closely, and the cracks in Linda's credibility were becoming clear. Linda's face tightened, but she didn't respond. Clint could see her faltering. "I have nothing more, Your Honor," Clint said, stepping back from the stand. As he returned to his seat, he could feel the eyes of the jury on him. For the first time, he felt a sense of power in this room, something he hadn't felt since the trial began. The tide was turning, and Clint Eastwood was not going down without a fight. Clint couldn't shake the tension that clung to him as the courtroom emptied for the day's recess. The battle had been fierce, but there was a gnawing feeling in his gut that they weren't out of the woods yet. Linda's testimony had rattled him more than he'd like to admit. She was a ghost from his past, someone who knew too much, and who had clearly chosen to use that knowledge to take him down. As he stood up from his seat, the weight of the day's events pressed down on him. He glanced over at Allison, who was already scanning her notes, her brow furrowed in concentration. She kept her cool throughout the entire cross-examination, but Clint could tell she was just as aware as he was that this trial was far from over. "We've got work to do," Allison said softly, glancing up at him. "You did well today. But Linda's testimony has given Simmons some ammunition. We need to find a way to discredit her." Clint nodded, trying to push the overwhelming sense of unease to the back of his mind. "I'll do whatever it takes. But we need something concrete. We need to show that she's not who she says she is." Allison stood up, her voice steady and focused. "We're not done yet. The jury's still listening, and we have one more chance to hit them with everything we've got. If we let this slide, we'll lose." Clint clenched his fists, feeling the adrenaline surge through him. This wasn't just a trial. It was a fight for his life. Everything he had worked for, everything he had built over the years, was at stake. His reputation, his legacy, and his future were hanging in the balance. As they walked out of the courtroom, Clint's mind raced. The air outside felt different, colder, sharper. But he couldn't afford to lose focus. He had to stay in control. The next day would be pivotal. He needed to find a way to turn the tide in his favor, once and for all. The next morning, the courthouse was filled with an air of palpable tension. Reporters crowded outside, their cameras flashing as they gathered to cover the high-profile case. Inside, the courtroom buzzed with hushed whispers as everyone took their seats. Clint took his place at the defense table, his eyes scanning the room, making sure everything was in order. He could feel the weight of the eyes on him. The jury, the press, the spectators. They were all waiting to see what would happen next. Allison sat down beside him, her voice low but urgent. "I've been doing some digging on Linda. There's something off about her story. We need to get the truth out before Simmons has a chance to twist it further." Clint's eyes narrowed. "What do you have?" "All I can say is that Linda Roberts has a history of being less than truthful. I've tracked down some of her previous business ventures, and there are inconsistencies. If we can expose those, we'll have a way to discredit her completely." Clint felt a spark of hope. This was the break they needed. If they could poke enough holes in Linda's credibility, it would make her entire testimony questionable. The jury wouldn't trust a word she said. He leaned in, his voice low. "Let's do it." The proceedings began, and the atmosphere in the courtroom was thick with anticipation. Judge Daniels banged his gavel, signaling the start of the day's session. "Mr. Simmons, the floor is yours," the judge announced. Simmons rose, his face hard and unyielding. He looked over at Clint with a confident smile, clearly believing that his star witness, Linda, had sealed the deal. Clint could see the arrogance in his posture, the way he carried himself as if the verdict was already a foregone conclusion. Simmons addressed the jury. "Ladies and gentlemen, we've heard from a variety of witnesses, each one pointing to the defendant's involvement in the illicit activities that have come to light. We've heard how he used his name and influence to conduct illegal dealings, and how he knowingly profited from these crimes." He paused, letting the weight of his words sink in. Clint could feel the eyes of the jury on him, waiting to see how he would respond. "We now have one final piece of evidence that will conclusively prove the defendant's guilt," Simmons continued, his voice filled with conviction. "Ms. Roberts has provided us with a detailed account of her work with Mr. Eastwood, and her testimony, alongside the hard evidence we've presented, leaves no doubt as to his involvement." Clint felt his heart pound. This was the moment that would either make or break the case. But then he remembered the words of Allison. "We have something on Linda." He couldn't let her win. The judge turned to Clint's defense team. "Mr. Eastwood, are you ready to proceed?" Clint stood up, his voice steady. "Yes, Your Honor. We are ready." Allison stood and addressed the court. "Your Honor, we will now proceed with our defense. We respectfully request that Ms. Roberts be recalled to the stand for further questioning." The judge nodded, and Simmons' confident smirk faltered just slightly. Linda was called back to the stand, her expression unreadable as she took her place once again. Clint felt a cold chill run down his spine as he watched her, but this time, he was ready. He had to be. Allison began, her voice calm and controlled. "Ms. Roberts, I've been reviewing your past business ventures, and there are some discrepancies that I think we need to address. In fact, we've discovered that you've been involved in several failed companies, including one that was recently investigated for fraudulent practices. Can you explain this? Linda's face stiffened, but she quickly recovered. I don't see how that's relevant to this case. Allison pressed on, her tone unwavering. It's relevant because it shows a pattern, Ms. Roberts. A pattern of deception, manipulation, and financial mismanagement. You've been involved in schemes before, and now you're here, testifying against Mr. Eastwood. The question is, why? Could it be that you have your own motivations for pointing the finger at him? The courtroom fell silent, and Clint could see Linda's composure begin to crack. She shifted in her seat, her hands clenched tightly in her lap. I'm here because I'm telling the truth, Linda said, her voice tight. Allison smiled slightly. Are you, though? Because everything we've found points to a very different story. And when your credibility is questioned, it's hard for the jury to trust anything you say. Clint watched as Linda faltered. This was it. The moment of reckoning had come. The cracks in her story were too obvious to ignore. And as the jury watched closely, Clint couldn't help but feel that the final pieces of the puzzle were finally falling into place. Linda shifted in her seat, visibly uncomfortable. The courtroom hung in the balance, and Clint felt a strange sense of anticipation pulse through him. He was starting to see it, the way the momentum was shifting. Linda's confidence was unraveling, and with it, the case against him. Allison, Clint whispered, leaning toward her. I think we've got her. Allison's gaze never left Linda as she pressed further. Ms. Roberts, in light of your previous business failures and the fraudulent schemes you've been involved in, I have one final question. How is it that you can stand here today and claim that Mr. Eastwood was involved in illegal activities when you yourself have a questionable track record? Linda clenched her jaw, trying to maintain her composure. I'm here to testify about the truth. About what I know. Is that so? Allison asked, her tone sharp. Because the truth seems to be that you've been involved in more than one scheme that's been under investigation. And yet, you're asking the jury to believe your word over Mr. Eastwood's, despite your own shady past. Don't you think that's something they should consider? The air in the courtroom thickened. Clint could almost hear the collective breath being held by everyone present. Linda's eyes darted nervously toward the jury, who were now all intently focused on her every word. The prosecutor, Simmons, looked as if he was about to rise to her defense, but Clint could see it in his eyes. This wasn't going the way he'd planned. For a brief moment, Linda faltered. She shifted in her seat again, clearly feeling the pressure. Then, she did the one thing that Clint had hoped she wouldn't. She snapped. You don't know anything about me? Linda spat, her voice rising. You don't know the things I've had to do to survive. You don't know what it's like to be pushed aside, to be ignored, to have your career ruined. I had to claw my way back, and if you think I'm just going to sit here and let him get away with this, you're wrong. There it was. The crack that Clint had been waiting for. Her outburst revealed more than Linda probably realized. She wasn't just testifying out of a sense of justice. She was angry. Angry that her past was being dragged into the light. Angry that Clint's defense was pushing her to a corner. Allison, do you have anything else to add? Judge Daniels interjected, his voice commanding but calm. Allison paused for a moment, collecting her thoughts. She turned back to Linda with a knowing look. You've already said a lot, Ms. Roberts. But one thing remains clear. You are angry, and that anger is clouding your judgment. I'm not sure the jury will believe someone who's emotionally compromised when it comes to providing credible testimony. Linda glared at Allison, but Clint could see the desperation in her eyes. The walls were closing in. Simmons stood, his expression hardening. Objection, Your Honor. Counsel is leading the witness. Judge Daniels considered the objection for a moment before shaking his head. Sustained. Ms. Roberts, please stick to the facts. Clint's heart was racing, but he felt a sense of calm settle over him. The truth was on their side, and they were finally getting through to the jury. The cracks in Linda's story were widening with every passing second. All I'm asking, Allison said, her voice cutting through the tension in the room, is that you acknowledge your past, Ms. Roberts. Your past with Clint Eastwood may not have been as clear-cut as you're presenting it. You were involved with several shady characters. You've had your own dealings with the law, and now you're here, accusing him of things he didn't do. That doesn't seem fair, does it? Linda's face reddened, and she opened her mouth as if to respond, but the words didn't come. Her composure was slipping, and she knew it. There was no turning back now. She had gone too far in defending her position, and the jury had already begun to see the cracks in her facade. Clint felt a sense of satisfaction, but he knew they weren't out of the woods yet. This was just the beginning of what would be an even tougher battle ahead. The day wore on, and despite the progress they'd made in undermining Linda's testimony, Clint knew that the next few hours would be crucial. The prosecution had more cards to play, and Clint wasn't going to assume victory until the final gavel fell. By the time the court broke for lunch, Clint was feeling the weight of the past few days pressed down on him. He had barely slept, his mind constantly turning over every detail of the case. But right now, all he could focus on was the next steps. Allison had arranged for him to meet with a private investigator who had been working on the case behind the scenes. Clint stepped out into the hallway, his legs stiff from sitting all morning. The investigator, a quiet man with an unassuming demeanor, was waiting for him in a small conference room. "You're looking sharp today, Mr. Eastwood," the investigator said, offering him a seat. Clint shook his head. "I'm running on fumes, to be honest. But we need to wrap this up. What do you have for me?" The investigator pulled out a stack of papers, his fingers moving quickly as he flipped through them. "We've been digging into Linda's past, as you requested, and it turns out there's more to her story than she's letting on. Specifically, we found a connection between her and some people who have a history of manipulating high-profile individuals for financial gain." Clint raised an eyebrow. "Are you saying she's been blackmailing people?" The investigator hesitated, then nodded. "Not exactly blackmail, but she has used her knowledge of certain people's weaknesses to secure leverage. There's evidence that she's been involved with a group that targets wealthy and influential figures, using their pasts against them to extort money or position. She's been part of this network for years." Clint's blood ran cold. This was worse than he could have imagined. Linda wasn't just a disgruntled ex-colleague. She was part of something far more dangerous, a professional, and now she was using everything in her power to take him down. "We need to get this information into the hands of the jury," Clint said, his voice tight. "If we can show that she's been using her connections to manipulate the system, we can destroy her credibility once and for all." The investigator nodded. "We'll make sure the jury hears about this." Clint's mind was racing. They had just found the ammunition they needed to end this case in their favor. But there was no room for error. They had to be strategic, precise, and ready for whatever the prosecution might throw at them. Back in the courtroom, the mood had shifted. The jury could sense the tension in the air as both sides prepared for the final arguments. Clint stood, taking one last breath before stepping into the arena. This was it, the last chance to win. "Allison," he said quietly, "we're not letting her win. Not today." Allison nodded. "Let's finish this." The final countdown had begun. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough? The courtroom was buzzing with anticipation as the day wore on, the pressure building with each passing minute. It was clear to Clint that everyone, his team, the jury, the judge, and the spectators, knew that this was the final stretch. There were no more chances for mistakes. His fate was hanging on the edge of a razor, and the weight of it pressed on his shoulders like an invisible burden. Clint's eyes flicked to Linda on the witness stand. She was visibly shaken now. Gone was the confident, assertive woman who had entered the courtroom days ago. The cracks in her testimony had been exposed, but her glare still had the power to freeze a man in his tracks. And Clint was more than ready to finish what they had started. The clock ticked loudly in the courtroom as the jury prepared for closing arguments. Everyone knew that the end was near. The judge cleared his throat. "Mr. Simmons, it's time for your closing argument." Simmons stood, adjusting his tie and taking a moment to survey the room. His expression was composed, yet there was a noticeable tinge of frustration. The case hadn't gone as smoothly as he had expected, but even now, he believed that Linda's testimony, alongside the evidence they had presented, would be enough to secure a conviction. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," Simmons began, his voice deep and commanding, You've heard all the evidence, and you've seen the kind of man Clint Eastwood truly is. A man who, despite his fame and wealth, has been involved in shady dealings and corrupt activities. We've heard from Ms. Roberts, who has bravely come forward to expose his wrongdoing. She has no reason to lie, no motive to harm him. Her testimony is consistent and truthful. He paused, letting his words sink in. Clint Eastwood may have built a career on being the tough, unshakable man. But now, he stands before you accused of crimes that have left a trail of victims behind him. It is time to hold him accountable. Clint felt the weight of Simmons' words, but he didn't allow himself to be swayed. He had heard it all before, the accusations, the insinuations. It was all part of the game, but he wasn't about to lose. Not when they had the truth on their side. As Simmons finished his speech, Clint's team stood, preparing for their own closing arguments. "Allison," Clint said under his breath, "it's all you now." Allison gave him a firm nod and rose to her feet. The courtroom seemed to hold its breath as she took her position. She was calm, composed, but there was an intensity in her eyes. A determination that came from knowing this was the moment they had been working toward. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," Allison's voice was steady, but it carried a weight of conviction that immediately commanded attention. "We've heard a lot about Clint Eastwood, and I won't deny that he's a man of influence, a man whose life has been lived under the microscope of the public eye. But I ask you to think about something very carefully. What are you really judging here? A man's public persona, or the facts that have been laid before you in this courtroom?" She paused, letting the words settle in the minds of the jury. "You've heard from Ms. Linda Roberts, a woman with a questionable history, a history that she has tried to hide. It's easy to believe her when she paints herself as the victim, the whistleblower who bravely stood up to a powerful man. But the truth is, her story has fallen apart piece by piece. She's not the victim here. She's the aggressor." Allison glanced over at Linda, who was now visibly uncomfortable in her seat. "We've shown that Ms. Roberts has a history of involvement in fraudulent activities, manipulations, and even attempts to extort high-profile individuals for her own gain. She's used her connections to target people like Clint Eastwood, trying to leverage their past to her benefit." She turned back to the jury, her gaze piercing. "You heard Linda's testimony, but you also heard the evidence that has been presented. You saw how her credibility was questioned at every turn. We are not here to defend Clint Eastwood's reputation as a Hollywood star. We're here to defend him from false accusations, from a woman who is trying to rewrite the truth for her own personal gain." Clint watched as the jury members exchanged glances, their faces unreadable. He knew he had to trust Allison. She had been the one to guide him through every step of this. She had fought for him when no one else believed. Allison's voice softened as she continued. "The truth is, Clint Eastwood has worked tirelessly for his success. He has earned everything he has through hard work, dedication, and a commitment to the people he cares about. He's not a criminal. He's not a villain. He's a man who made mistakes, like any of us, but who has paid for those mistakes. He doesn't deserve to be punished for something he didn't do." Clint felt the strength of her words wash over him. This was it. The jury was listening. The case was in their hands now. "The truth is, the only person who has manipulated this case is Ms. Roberts," Allison concluded. "She's made herself a pawn in a game she doesn't fully understand, trying to take down a man who stands far above her. And now, it's up to you to decide what is just. Will you let lies and deceit stand in the way of the truth?" The courtroom was silent as Allison finished her closing argument. Clint could hear the sound of his own heart pounding in his chest. It was done. The case had been laid out before the jury, and now all they could do was wait for the verdict. Judge Daniels stood, bringing the courtroom to attention. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, you have heard all the evidence. It is now your responsibility to deliberate and decide the fate of the defendant. You are dismissed for the day to begin your deliberations. We will reconvene tomorrow for the verdict." Clint's breath caught in his throat. This was it, the moment they had all been waiting for. He stood there for a moment, unsure if he should feel relieved or if the tension would simply drag him further into the unknown. But before he could make a move, Allison was by his side. "You did well, Clint," she said quietly. "Now we wait." Clint's mind raced as he left the courtroom with Allison. The air outside felt cold, and the world seemed to stretch out before him in a haze. Tomorrow, the jury would deliver their verdict. Would it be in his favor? Would they see the truth? Or would his reputation be destroyed forever? He didn't know. All he knew was that, for the first time in his life, he wasn't in control. And it was terrifying. The night was a restless one for Clint. He tossed and turned in bed, his thoughts swirling with the endless possibilities of what the next day would bring. He could hear the ticking of the clock on the nightstand, each second seeming to stretch longer than the last. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Linda's face, her anger, her desperation, and he knew that she wasn't going to go down easily. She had made it clear from the start that she would do whatever it took to win. But Clint had fought too long, too hard, to let everything unravel now. Allison had warned him that the waiting would be the hardest part. It wasn't just about the case. It was about trusting in the process, in the truth they had presented. As much as Clint wanted to believe that justice would prevail, a part of him feared that the jury might still be swayed by the lies, by the manipulation that had been woven throughout the trial. He had been on the other side of the law before, but this felt different. This wasn't just about facing a foe in a movie. This was real. The stakes were as high as they could get. The future of his career, his freedom, his entire life, depended on the decision of 12 strangers. By the time dawn broke, Clint had barely slept. He dressed in his best suit, the one he wore when he needed to remind the world that Clint Eastwood wasn't someone you could break so easily. His reflection in the mirror stared back at him, a man who had lived a life of highs and lows, and now faced one of the greatest challenges of his career. He walked into the courthouse with Allison at his side. The weight of the world seemed to rest on his shoulders, but he pushed it down. He wasn't going to let it break him. The courtroom was already filled when they arrived. The air was thick with tension, and every person present seemed to be holding their breath in anticipation. The jury was already seated, their faces serious and unreadable. At the front of the room, Linda sat next to her attorney, her eyes narrowed, her expression tight with both defiance and fear. Clint sat down in his seat, his hands folded neatly in his lap. He looked across the room at Allison, who gave him a subtle nod of reassurance. "Clint, I know how you're feeling," she whispered, leaning in, "but we've done everything we can. Now it's in their hands. Trust in the truth." Clint gave a small nod, but the weight of the uncertainty still lingered. He had seen cases like this before, where everything seemed to be in favor of the defense, only to have the jury surprise everyone with a guilty verdict. But this time, he had more than just facts on his side. He had truth, and truth had a way of cutting through the darkness. After what seemed like an eternity, Judge Daniels entered the courtroom, and the room fell silent. The proceedings were about to begin. He took his seat, and with a simple gesture, the courtroom was ready for the verdict. "Has the jury reached a verdict?" the judge asked, his voice carrying the weight of authority. A man from the jury stood, holding the piece of paper that would decide Clint's fate. The room fell completely still as the jury member walked forward and handed the paper to the judge. The judge scanned the paper briefly, then looked up at the room, his eyes sweeping over everyone before he spoke. "In the matter of the case against Clint Eastwood, we the jury find the defendant." The world seemed to slow down. Clint held his breath, his heart pounding in his chest. "Not guilty." There was a moment of stunned silence. The words echoed in Clint's ears, and for a second, he couldn't process what he was hearing. The weight that had been pressing on his chest for days, for weeks, for months, lifted. It was as if the entire burden had been suddenly torn away, leaving him standing in a space where only the truth could exist. Clint stood slowly, his legs weak from the tension that had built up over the course of the trial. He could feel Allison's hand on his shoulder, a quiet reassurance. His eyes scanned the room, landing on Linda. Her face was pale, her expression one of disbelief. For the first time in the trial, she didn't seem like the one in control. It was over. Clint's chest swelled with relief, but his mind was still racing. He had won, but the battle had been hard fought, and it had cost him more than he'd ever expected. The judge banged his gavel, signaling the end of the trial. "This court is adjourned. Mr. Eastwood is free to go." Clint's legs felt unsteady, and he wasn't sure if it was from the exhaustion of the trial or the flood of emotions now rushing through him. He glanced around the courtroom, but the faces that met his gaze weren't those of enemies. They were of people who had seen him through a storm and had made sure he made it out the other side. Allison gave him a warm smile. "You did it, Clint. You're free." Clint didn't know what to say. Words felt inadequate in that moment. He had fought, and now, finally, the truth had prevailed. As Clint left the courthouse, the sun was shining brighter than he remembered. It wasn't just the weight of the trial that had lifted. It was a sense of redemption, of clarity, of the kind of victory that went beyond the legal system. It wasn't just about the verdict. It was about reclaiming something he had almost lost, the truth about who he was. The streets were busy, people rushing to and from their destinations, but for Clint, time had slowed. For the first time in a long while, he felt at peace. "Clint, can I say something?" Allison asked, walking beside him. Clint nodded. "Of course. You didn't just win a legal case today. You reclaimed your story. The world tried to rewrite it, and you fought back." Clint paused for a moment, reflecting on her words. He had fought for justice, yes, but in doing so, he had also reminded himself who he was. He wasn't just a celebrity, a figure in the public eye, or a person to be torn apart by scandal. He was Clint Eastwood, a man who fought for what was right. "I guess I did," Clint said quietly, "but I couldn't have done it without you." Allison smiled. "I'm just glad I could help. Now, let's take it one step at a time." The two of them walked down the street, the future unknown but wide open before them. The days that followed Clint's acquittal were filled with both relief and reflection. As the media frenzy surrounding his case began to die down, Clint found himself standing at the precipice of a new phase in his life. For the first time in years, he didn't feel the weight of looming scandal or the pressure to maintain a public image. The storm had passed, and he could finally breathe again. He didn't know what the future held, but for once, he didn't feel the need to have everything figured out. He had spent so much of his life trying to control every aspect of his career and his reputation, but now, he was learning that sometimes, letting go was the most freeing thing he could do. Allison had become not only his legal savior, but a close confidant. They had spent long hours talking after the trial, discussing the case, and finding comfort in knowing that they had done their best. But even as the professional relationship between them had been cemented, Clint knew there was something more growing between them, something that wasn't so easily defined. He had never been one to mix business with pleasure, but he couldn't deny the way Allison made him feel. She was intelligent, compassionate, and strong. Qualities that he admired, even more now than before. Clint had spent much of his life behind closed doors, keeping people at arm's length, but there was something about Allison's presence that made him want to open up, to allow himself to trust again. One evening, as Clint sat in his living room, staring out at the city skyline, his phone buzzed with a text message. It was from Allison. "Hey Clint, got a minute? I wanted to talk about something, but no rush." Clint smiled, his fingers hovering over the phone screen as he considered his response. He was used to being the one in control, but with Allison, everything felt different. There was a sense of calmness when they spoke, a feeling of partnership that Clint hadn't realized he needed until now. He quickly typed back, "I have all the time in the world. What's on your mind?" A few minutes later, Allison called him. "Hey," she greeted him softly. "I was just thinking. We've been through a lot together lately, and I guess I wanted to check in, see how you're feeling now that everything's over. You've been through a major ordeal, and I know it hasn't been easy. How are you really doing?" Clint leaned back in his chair, closing his eyes for a moment. "I'm good," he replied, his voice steady. "Better than I've been in a long time. I can finally think clearly. I don't have to wake up every day wondering if I'll be dragged back into the fire." There was a pause on the other end, as if Allison was processing his words. "I'm glad to hear that. But, Clint, I also want to ask you something. And you can tell me if I'm overstepping, but I think it's time for you to think about what's next. You've been through a lot, and now you have a chance to reset, to figure out who you want to be going forward. I know the last thing you probably want right now is more pressure, but you have so many opportunities in front of you." Clint nodded slowly, even though Allison couldn't see him. Her words had struck a chord deep within him. He had spent so many years focused on surviving the next storm, he hadn't thought about what came after. "I've always been about the next project," Clint said quietly, almost to himself. "But you're right. Maybe it's time for me to think about something bigger than just work." There was a gentle understanding in Allison's voice. "I don't mean to pressure you, Clint, but you've earned the right to think about the next chapter, however you define it. Maybe that means taking a step back, exploring new avenues, or even just focusing on the people who matter most. I just don't want you to get lost in what everyone else expects you to do. This is your life." Clint's chest tightened. He had always known what was expected of him. His whole career had been about meeting expectations, whether as an actor, a director, or a public figure. But in this moment, he realized that for the first time, he didn't need to follow anyone's script but his own. "Thank you," Clint said, his voice thick with emotion. "I needed to hear that. I think it's time to stop running and start living for me." There was a soft laugh on the other end of the line. "I'm glad to hear that. And remember, whatever you decide, I'll be here to support you." For a moment, Clint allowed himself to feel something he hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. Hope that he could still write the next chapter of his life, even if he didn't know exactly what it looked like yet. The next few days were filled with reflection. Clint took time for himself, walking the streets of the city that had been both his home and his battleground. He found comfort in the simplicity of those moments, sitting at a cafe, watching people go by, feeling the warmth of the sun on his face. It was a new kind of freedom, one he hadn't known he'd been missing. He reached out to some of his old friends, people he hadn't spoken to in years. They met up at his favorite bar, sharing drinks and stories from the past. It felt like reconnecting with a part of himself he had buried deep beneath the pressures of his career. As the days turned into weeks, Clint knew that it was time to decide what came next. He had been given a second chance, not just in the eyes of the law, but in his own life. The weight of the past was still there, but it was no longer defining him. And then, one evening, as Clint sat in his study with a glass of bourbon in hand, an idea began to form. It wasn't an idea for a new film or a new project. It was something far more personal. He had always loved telling stories, but he realized that maybe it was time to tell his own. A story of redemption, of triumph, and of the man he had become through it all. With a small, satisfied smile, Clint reached for his notebook. He didn't know where this new journey would take him, but for the first time in a long while, he was ready to begin again. The following days were full of quiet contemplation. Clint had been through his fair share of turmoil, but now he was in uncharted territory. No longer shackled by the demands of public scrutiny or legal battles, he found himself facing a different kind of challenge, deciding what to do next. The weight of his choices was heavier than he had anticipated. He had lived a life built on action, on making quick decisions and taking immediate steps toward the next big goal. Now, for the first time, he was allowing himself the space to think. He wasn't rushing to make a move, and that was an unfamiliar feeling. Clint knew that he couldn't go back to the grind of Hollywood the way he had before. He had been through too much, seen too many sides of the industry, and learned things that couldn't be unlearned. The fame, the attention, the endless cycle of premieres and press tours. It all felt like a distant memory. But there was one thing Clint had always known deep down. He couldn't leave the world of storytelling. It was in his blood. Whether it was acting, directing, or writing, Clint had always been captivated by the power of narrative. He had spent his entire career creating stories that others could connect with, but now, he found himself wondering if he had a story of his own to tell. Why not? Clint muttered to himself one evening as he sat in front of his desk, the soft glow of the desk lamp illuminating the empty pages before him. He had always been a man of action, of doing, not thinking. But now, with his future uncertain, it felt like the perfect moment to reflect. He could take what he'd been through, the challenges, the triumphs, the battles, and weave it into something meaningful. A book, a memoir, perhaps, about his journey, not just as a celebrity, but as a man who had faced his own vulnerabilities and weaknesses. It would be a story of redemption, of fighting through the darkest times and coming out stronger on the other side. As he sat there, the idea took root in his mind. He didn't know the exact shape it would take, but he knew that this was the direction he wanted to go in. It was time for him to step into the next phase of his life, not as a washed-up star or a tabloid target, but as Clint Eastwood, the person who had lived through it all and come out the other side. His phone buzzed on the desk, pulling him from his thoughts. He picked it up and saw a message from Allison. "Hey Clint, I've been thinking. I know you've been through a lot, but I want to remind you that you don't have to do this alone. If you're thinking about a new project, whether it's writing or something else, know that I'm here for whatever you need." Clint smiled as he read the message. She always knew the right thing to say. Her unwavering support had been a constant in his life, and he knew that whatever he decided, she would be right there beside him. The idea of sharing this journey with someone who understood him, someone who had seen both the good and the bad, was comforting. He quickly typed back, "Thanks, Allison. That means more than you know. I think I figured out what I want to do next. It's time to share my story." Her response came almost immediately. "That's amazing, Clint. I knew you'd come to this decision. Let's make it happen." Clint set the phone down and leaned back in his chair, his fingers tapping on the desk. He wasn't sure how long it would take to write, or whether anyone would care to read his story. But in that moment, he didn't care about the potential outcomes. What mattered was that he was finally doing something for himself. He was taking control of his narrative in a way he never had before. The following weeks were filled with new energy for Clint. Every morning, he would wake up with a sense of purpose that had been missing from his life for too long. He was up before dawn, sitting at his desk with a cup of coffee, the sound of the city filtering in through the windows as he typed away. Writing wasn't easy. There were moments when the words felt forced, when the memories he had been avoiding seemed too painful to confront. But there were also moments of clarity, of peace, when the words flowed effortlessly. He found himself recounting memories from his childhood, his early days in the industry, the people who had influenced him, and the lessons he had learned along the way. He began to realize that this book wasn't just about him. It was about the people who had shaped him, both good and bad. He thought of his family, the ones who had stood by him even when the world seemed determined to tear him apart. He thought of the friends who had offered him guidance, even when he hadn't been ready to listen. And he thought of Allison, whose unwavering belief in him had given him the strength to keep going, even when everything seemed to be falling apart. As Clint wrote, he found himself growing closer to the man he had been, the man he had become, and the man he was still learning to be. The act of writing became a form of therapy, helping him process emotions he hadn't fully understood until he put them on paper. One evening, after a particularly difficult chapter, Clint sat back in his chair, exhausted. He had written about the darkest moments of his life, the mistakes, the regrets, and the missteps. It wasn't easy to relive those times, but he knew it was necessary. This wasn't just a book for his fans. It was a book for himself, a way to make sense of everything that had happened. A knock at the door pulled him from his thoughts. He stood up and walked to the door, opening it to reveal Allison, holding 2 cups of coffee. "Figured you could use a break," she said with a warm smile. Clint took the coffee and led her inside. He had been so immersed in his writing that he hadn't realized how much he needed someone to talk to. As they sat down together, he found himself opening up in a way he hadn't before. "I think I've finally figured out who I am, Allison," Clint said quietly. "This book, it's not just about telling my story. It's about accepting everything that I've been through, the good, the bad, the ugly, and learning to live with it all." Allison nodded, her eyes filled with understanding. "That's the first step, Clint, and I'm so proud of you for taking it." The two of them sat in silence for a while, sipping their coffee. Clint had no idea where this new path would lead, but for the first time in a long time, he was content with the uncertainty. He was ready to write the next chapter of his life, one that would be defined not by his past mistakes, but by the person he was becoming. The weeks following Clint's decision to write his memoir felt like a fresh start. His days had transformed into a routine of writing, reflecting, and recalibrating his mind for the next chapter of his life. But even with the newfound purpose, there was a lingering question in Clint's mind. What if this was just another distraction? What if he was avoiding the truth, simply masking the deeper issues that still plagued him? Those thoughts crept in during moments of solitude, when the words on the page began to slow. But then he would look at the blank page in front of him, and the same resolve would return. The past had been turbulent, but this was his moment to reclaim control, to redefine himself not only for the world but for himself. Despite the clarity that had come with his decision, the world outside of his writing bubble had continued to spin. His inbox was flooded with requests for interviews, film offers, and even a few whispers of potential new roles in upcoming blockbuster films. But Clint wasn't interested in the familiar noise anymore. For the first time in years, he was more invested in his own narrative than the scripts or public opinion. He sat down each morning with his coffee, the soothing silence of his study his only companion, as he poured out his thoughts. There were times when the memories felt too raw, too vivid to confront, but he knew he had to. He had to go through it all, even the darkest parts. Only then could he truly make peace with everything he had experienced. One afternoon, as Clint worked on an especially tough chapter, there was a knock at the door. He glanced up, blinking in surprise. It was rare for anyone to visit unannounced. He stood up slowly and made his way to the door, expecting perhaps a friend or another well-meaning visitor. But when he opened it, he was met with an unexpected sight. Standing in front of him was none other than Judge Taylor, the very same judge who had mocked him in court, whose disdain had been so palpable during the trial. Clint's brow furrowed as he took in the unexpected visitor. "Clint," Judge Taylor said, his voice firm yet carrying an unusual weight. "I owe you an apology." Clint stood frozen for a moment. The last time he had seen this man, he had felt an overwhelming sense of injustice, like a bitter taste he couldn't shake off. But now, here he was, standing at his doorstep with a look of sincerity in his eyes. "I wasn't expecting you," Clint said, his voice guarded. Judge Taylor gave a short, almost embarrassed laugh. "I can imagine. But I didn't come here to argue or make excuses. I came to admit that I was wrong. During the trial, I let my personal biases cloud my judgment. I didn't see you for who you truly are. I saw the Hollywood persona, the public figure, and I failed to understand the person standing before me." Clint's eyes narrowed, still unsure of the man's intentions. He wasn't one to easily forgive or forget. But there was something in the judge's voice that rang true. "You mocked me in court," Clint said flatly, the memory of the trial still fresh in his mind. "You made me feel like a joke?" Judge Taylor took a deep breath, his posture stiff as if he had rehearsed what he was about to say 1,000 times. "I know, and I've carried that regret with me ever since. I let my personal feelings interfere with my role as a judge, and for that, I am deeply sorry." Clint's gaze softened, just a fraction. This wasn't what he had expected. He had thought the judge would come here to gloat, to make some excuse or somehow twist the truth, but instead, he was admitting to his mistakes. "You were right about one thing," the judge continued. "You have been through more than anyone should have to endure, and I've seen that. I've had time to reflect on my own actions, and I realize now that I misjudged you. Not just as a man, but as someone who was simply caught up in a system that often forgets the human side of the equation." Clint remained silent for a moment, weighing the judge's words carefully. This wasn't a typical apology. It wasn't filled with bravado or self-justification. It was genuine. "I appreciate you saying that," Clint said, finally speaking, "but it doesn't change the fact that you humiliated me in front of millions of people. That doesn't go away." The judge nodded, accepting the truth of Clint's words. "I understand, and I don't expect you to forgive me, but I had to come here and at least try to make amends. You deserve that much." Clint studied him for a moment longer, then took a step back. "I won't pretend everything is okay, but I can respect that you're owning up to your mistakes. It's more than I could have expected." The judge looked relieved, and for a moment, there was a shift in the air between them. Neither of them was quite sure what would come next, but Clint felt a slight weight lift from his chest. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet at least, but it was progress. For the first time in a long while, Clint didn't feel the burning need for vengeance. He was learning that moving forward didn't always mean carrying the past with you. It meant leaving room for growth, even in the most unlikely of situations. Judge Taylor extended his hand, offering it as a gesture of finality. "Take care, Clint. I truly hope you find peace with everything." Clint hesitated for a moment, But then, with a quiet nod, he shook the judge's hand. It wasn't an act of reconciliation. It was simply an acknowledgement that they both had their paths to walk, and sometimes, those paths intersected in unexpected ways. As the judge walked away, Clint closed the door behind him and leaned against it, breathing deeply. He wasn't sure if he had completely forgiven the man, but something in him had shifted. He realized that forgiveness wasn't something that could be forced. It was something that would come with time, if it came at all. What mattered now was that Clint had taken another step forward in his journey. Every encounter, every challenge, was a part of that story he was writing, a story of redemption, understanding, and growth. Sitting back down at his desk, Clint returned to the pages of his memoir. The words flowed more easily now, the burden of past resentment easing just a little. He was learning that sometimes, letting go wasn't just about moving on. It was about choosing not to carry the weight of the past with you any longer. With a newfound sense of clarity, Clint typed the first words of the new chapter in his life. It had been a few weeks since Clint's encounter with Judge Taylor, and the days seemed to move with a renewed sense of purpose. The silence in Clint's study wasn't empty anymore. It was filled with possibilities. He had started to see his memoir not just as a recount of past events, but as a tool for reflection, a guide for his future. The process of writing, of sifting through his life and analyzing his mistakes and victories, was transforming him in ways he had never imagined. The phone buzzed on his desk, breaking the stillness. Clint glanced at it, then set his pen down before picking it up. It was a message from Allison, as expected. She had been a constant presence in his life, especially since he had started writing his memoir. "Clint, I've been thinking. We should take a break. Get out of the house. You've been working hard, and I think you need to clear your head. What do you think? A trip? Maybe a few days away?" Clint stared at the message, the idea immediately appealing. He had been buried in his work, and while the progress was undeniable, there was something to be said for stepping away from it all. He could feel the exhaustion creeping up on him. The weight of his memories and the emotional toll of revisiting his past had been heavier than he anticipated. Maybe a change of scenery would help, he thought. He quickly typed a response. "You're right. A trip sounds good. When do we leave?" Allison's reply was almost instantaneous. "How about tomorrow? I'll take care of the details. You just pack. I think you deserve a little time away from the pages." Clint chuckled to himself. He had spent years in the hustle and bustle of Hollywood, and now, a simple getaway felt like a luxury. For a man who had known fame, fortune, and the spotlight, peace and quiet seemed like the greatest treasures of all. The next morning, Clint found himself packing a suitcase, a strange sense of freedom bubbling up inside him. He wasn't sure where they were going, but that was part of the appeal. There were no expectations, no red carpets to walk, no cameras or interviews. Just him and Allison, away from the world, to catch their breath. As he zipped up his suitcase, Clint paused for a moment, thinking about the past few months. He had come so far, emotionally and mentally. He had opened up in ways he hadn't thought possible. The book was becoming something greater than he could have imagined, and even though he hadn't finished it yet, he felt a sense of accomplishment. He was finally facing the truth about himself, and that was a victory in itself. Allison picked him up early that afternoon. She had arranged for a private plane to take them to a secluded cabin in the mountains, a place that had no connection to his past, no reminders of the chaos that had once surrounded him. It was a place for peace, a place to simply be. As they flew, Clint gazed out the window, watching the landscape change below him. The city lights faded into the distance, replaced by rolling hills and vast stretches of untouched wilderness. There was something calming about the vastness of it all, something that made him feel small in the best possible way. For once, he wasn't Clint Eastwood, the actor or the public figure. He was just Clint, a man in search of something more, someone trying to find his own path. They arrived at the cabin just as the sun began to set, casting a warm golden hue over the surrounding landscape. The air was fresh and crisp, the kind of air Clint hadn't breathed in years. It felt like a new beginning. Allison led him inside, where a fire crackled in the stone fireplace. The cabin was cozy, warm, and filled with the kind of tranquility that Clint had forgotten existed. As he set his suitcase down, He took a deep breath. The weight of his everyday life temporarily lifted. This was exactly what he needed. "Let's just enjoy the silence for a bit," Allison said, handing him a glass of wine. "No pressure. No deadlines. Just us." Clint nodded, a rare smile pulling at the corners of his mouth. He had always been used to having a schedule, to being on the go. But now, the idea of slowing down, of just being in the moment, felt like a gift. They spent the evening by the fire, talking about everything and nothing at all. It wasn't the kind of conversation that needed to go anywhere. It was comfortable, easy. Clint found himself laughing more than he had in a long time, something he hadn't realized he missed so much. The simplicity of the moment was enough. The next few days were filled with long hikes, quiet mornings by the lake, and late-night talks under the stars. They didn't discuss the book or Clint's past. Instead, they simply existed in the present. The weight of his story, the burden of his past, seemed far away in this peaceful retreat. But Clint knew that he couldn't avoid his story forever. The memoir, after all, was waiting for him. His journey, both personal and creative, was far from over. He had spent so many years trying to outrun his past, trying to bury the things that haunted him. But now, he was learning that the only way forward was to confront those things head-on. The book would be the culmination of that journey, a reflection of who he had been, who he was, and who he hoped to become. It was on one of their final evenings in the cabin that Clint had a breakthrough. As they sat on the porch, watching the sun dip below the mountains, he realized that writing his story wasn't just about sharing the details of his life. It was about accepting everything that had shaped him, the good and the bad, the mistakes, the triumphs, the failures, the love, the loss. It was all part of him. He turned to Allison, who was staring out at the horizon, a contented smile on her face. "I think I've figured it out," Clint said, his voice steady. "This book isn't just for me. It's for anyone who's ever had to pick themselves up after everything fell apart. It's about redemption, about accepting that the past doesn't have to define you. You can always change. You can always grow." Allison turned to him, her eyes bright. "I think that's the most important thing you've said." Clint smiled, feeling lighter than he had in a long time. He had found clarity, and with it, a renewed sense of purpose. The road ahead wasn't going to be easy, but he was ready. For the first time in a long while, Clint felt like he had everything he needed to face whatever came next. Clint's time in the mountains had been an oasis, a much-needed break from the storm of his past. But as the final day of their retreat came to an end, reality slowly crept back into view. The calm, the peace, the endless quiet would soon be replaced by the constant noise of the outside world. He had known this all along, but for the first time in years, he wasn't dreading the transition. The clarity he had gained during the trip made him ready to face what lay ahead. The private jet touched down at the airport with the same quiet efficiency that had marked their departure. Clint's mind still wandered back to the cabin, to the gentle sunsets and the long walks with Allison. But as he gathered his belongings and made his way through the terminal, the usual hum of life in the city started to tug at him, pulling him back to the demands of his day-to-day existence. As they drove back to his home, Clint reflected on the past few days. It had been so simple. No fanfare, no press, no expectations. Just him, Allison, and nature. In that simplicity, he had found something rare, peace. "How are you feeling?" Allison asked, glancing over at him from the passenger seat. Clint looked out the window, watching the city slowly come into view. "I feel different. Lighter, I guess. Like I've finally put some things behind me. But I know there's still work to do." Allison nodded, understanding the unspoken weight behind his words. "You're not alone in this, Clint. You've made progress, but the real work, well, that's just beginning." Her words echoed in his mind as they arrived at his house. He stepped inside, immediately feeling the difference between the quiet of the cabin and the bustle of his home. The familiar sounds of everyday life were there. His phone buzzing with new messages, the TV murmuring in the background, the gentle hum of life outside his windows. It was a world that never stopped spinning, and it was waiting for him to step back into it. He sat down at his desk, his eyes briefly scanning the piles of mail and papers that had accumulated in his absence. The reminders of his commitments, interviews, and potential roles were all there, silently urging him to take action. But Clint didn't reach for them immediately. Instead, he turned to the manuscript of his memoir, which was still waiting for his attention. He had started to see it as more than just a book. It was his own roadmap to healing, a journey that was far from over. The first few pages of the memoir came easily when he had written them in the quiet of the mountains. But now, with the demands of real life pressing in on him, it felt different. His thoughts were more scattered, and the weight of what he had yet to address in his story seemed heavier than before. His phone buzzed again, pulling him from his thoughts. He picked it up and saw that it was a text from an unfamiliar number. Hesitantly, he opened it. "Clint, I know this might seem out of the blue, but I've been thinking a lot about our time in court. I've got a lot of respect for you, and I think it's time we talk." It was from Judge Taylor. Clint felt a tightness in his chest at the sight of the message. The judge had reached out to him before, apologizing for his behavior during the trial, but Clint hadn't fully processed what that meant. The past few days had been about moving forward, and he hadn't wanted to dwell on things he couldn't change. But now, the judge's message was pulling him back into that chapter of his life. Clint debated for a moment, then decided to respond. "What do you want to talk about?" The reply came quickly. "I think we should meet in person. I know I can't undo what happened, but I owe you more than an apology over text. I want to explain myself." Clint hesitated. The old Clint would have immediately dismissed any further interaction. He didn't need closure from anyone who had wronged him. But this time, he found himself considering it. The past few days had opened him up in ways he hadn't expected. Perhaps this conversation could bring more clarity, more understanding. Or perhaps it would give him the final piece of closure he didn't even realize he still needed. Clint took a deep breath and texted back, "All right, when and where?" The arrangement was simple, a quiet cafe downtown, the kind of place that was public enough to ensure privacy, but still intimate enough for a meaningful conversation. Clint found himself uncertain about what to expect. He didn't know if this would be another round of apologies or a genuine attempt at mending the rift between them. But it didn't matter. He was ready. The next day, he walked into the cafe, his eyes scanning the crowd for the familiar face. It didn't take long to spot Judge Taylor, sitting at a corner table, looking just as out of place as Clint had imagined. His stiff posture, the way he sat up straight, seemed to carry the weight of a man who had spent years trying to uphold an image of authority. But there was something different in his demeanor today, something that hinted at vulnerability. Clint walked over and sat down, his expression unreadable. For a moment, neither of them spoke. There was an awkwardness in the air, a tension from the past that neither man could ignore. Finally, Judge Taylor broke the silence. "Clint, I'm not sure what you're expecting, but I can't change what happened. All I can offer is my truth and my regret for the way I treated you." Clint took a slow breath, his eyes meeting the judge's. "You were wrong, but I've been wrong too. We all make mistakes. I spent so much time carrying the weight of that trial, but I've learned that it's not worth holding onto anger forever." The judge looked relieved, the corners of his mouth twitching into what might have been a small, reluctant smile. "I never thought I'd hear you say that." Clint chuckled softly. "Neither did I." They spent the next hour talking, not just about the trial, but about life in general. They spoke candidly about their regrets, their fears, and their personal battles. It was strange, this connection that had emerged between them, but it felt like a moment of mutual respect, a recognition that despite their differences, they had both been through things that had shaped them in ways they couldn't have predicted. As Clint left the cafe, he felt something shift within him. The past was no longer an anchor holding him back. He had allowed himself the space to move forward, and now, even the most unexpected of encounters had contributed to his journey. He stepped back into his life, his thoughts clearer than they had been in years. The story wasn't over yet. The past wasn't forgotten, but it no longer held the same power over him. Clint was ready for whatever the future had in store, confident that he could face it head-on, with grace and understanding. As the days passed since his meeting with Judge Taylor, Clint began to feel the weight of the world start to lift from his shoulders. The unresolved tension he had carried for so long, especially in relation to the trial, felt like it was finally dissipating. Even though it had been just one conversation, Clint sensed a shift in how he viewed not only his past but also his future. The haunting echoes of his public life, his career, and the chaos they had created no longer seemed to have the same power over him. Yet, life had a way of throwing challenges at the most unexpected times. One evening, Clint received a call that would force him to confront his current life in a way he hadn't anticipated. The number on the screen was unfamiliar, but the voice that greeted him on the other end was one he knew all too well. "Clint, it's Jane." Jane, his longtime agent, the one who had been with him through the highs and lows of his career. She had always been the voice of reason, the person who could balance his impulsiveness with a clear business mind. But this time, her tone was different. There was something urgent, something more serious in her voice that immediately put Clint on edge. "Clint, listen. I don't know how to say this, but I need you to prepare yourself for what's coming. A story's about to break. Someone's trying to sell a narrative about your past, about your behavior on set, and it's not pretty." Clint's mind froze for a moment. He leaned back in his chair, his fingers tightening around the phone. "What kind of narrative?" "It's about you being difficult to work with, temperamental, hard to manage," Jane continued, the words coming out faster now. "I know it's not true, Clint, but someone's trying to spin it like you were a nightmare behind the scenes. I don't want to alarm you, but it's going to hit the tabloids soon. I just wanted you to hear it from me first." Clint's heart raced. He'd spent years building a reputation in Hollywood, one that was hard-won and carefully crafted. Now, it seemed that all that work could be undone in a matter of hours. He had learned how quickly the media could turn against someone, how swiftly a single story could change everything. It was a game he had played for decades, but this time, it felt different. This time, it was personal. He took a deep breath, trying to steady himself. "What do we do? First, I need you to stay calm. We're going to handle this. I'm going to contact the press team, and we'll prepare a statement, but we need to get ahead of this. The last thing we want is for it to spiral." Clint exhaled slowly, his mind racing. The past was always lurking in the shadows, waiting for the right moment to resurface. He had thought that by addressing his own demons, by confronting the mistakes of his past in his memoir, he could reclaim control over his narrative. But now, it felt as though the world was about to rewrite that story for him. "I'll be ready," Clint said, his voice steady but laced with a certain edge. "Just keep me in the loop." After hanging up, Clint stared out the window, lost in thought. It wasn't the first time something like this had happened. Hollywood was a place where reputations were made and broken with a single headline. But this felt different. The old Clint would have fought back with all the fire he could muster. He would have gone on the defensive, shot down the allegations, and made it clear that the world had misunderstood him. But now, as he sat there, a part of him knew that perhaps fighting wasn't the answer this time. Clint had spent so much of his life trying to control how the world saw him. He had shaped his image carefully. Every movie role, every interview, every public appearance had been a calculated move. But here he was, facing something he couldn't control. A part of him felt exposed, vulnerable. But then, the clarity from his time in the mountains came rushing back. His time with Allison, the peaceful moments, the realization that the past didn't define him anymore. It had all been part of a journey that had led him here. Maybe, just maybe, he could approach this challenge differently. He reached for his notebook, the one he had started using for his memoir. Flipping it open, Clint began to write. It wasn't part of the book, at least, not directly. But it felt like the most honest thing he could do in this moment. He wasn't just writing for the world anymore. He was writing for himself. You can't control how people see you. You can only control how you respond. The truth will always come to light in its own time. It wasn't much, but it was enough. He had always prided himself on being the one to dictate his future, but maybe the time had come to let go of that need for control. What would happen next wasn't up to him, but how he handled it, how he responded to the storm, was. The next morning, Clint's phone buzzed again, pulling him from his thoughts. It was a message from Jane. "The story's dropped. It's already on the wire. I'm preparing a statement, but we need to be ready for what comes next. It might get messy, Clint." Clint stared at the message for a moment, feeling the familiar knot tighten in his stomach. He could feel the weight of what was coming, but he also felt a certain calmness, an understanding that the storm would pass, just like everything else in life. He took a deep breath and responded, "Let's face it head on. I'm ready." The moment had arrived. The battle for his reputation was about to begin, but Clint was no longer the man he had been before. Ready to fight at all costs, ready to defend every inch of his image. No, this time, he would take a different approach. He would confront the truth, stand by the man he had become, and let the world see him for who he truly was. The news hit the headlines faster than Clint had anticipated. By the time he finished his coffee the next morning, the story was everywhere. It was sensationalized, twisted, and filled with half-truths. The tabloids were having a field day, painting Clint as a difficult, temperamental star who had caused chaos on movie sets, storming off, insulting colleagues, and making unreasonable demands. The accusations weren't new. They were exaggerated versions of the challenges every actor faced on set, but to the public, it didn't matter. The narrative had been set. The more the media ran with the story, the more the public seemed to believe it. Clint sat in his office, his eyes glued to the screen as the media storm took shape. He could feel the pull of the past again, trying to drag him back into a fight he had hoped was behind him. The familiar anger simmered beneath the surface. He wanted to lash out, to deny everything, to set the record straight. But then, he thought back to the lessons he had learned during his time in the mountains, the lessons that had shifted something deep within him. He wasn't going to be that person anymore. He wasn't going to let anger dictate his actions. Instead, Clint focused on what he could control. He called Jane. "Clint," she said as she picked up the phone, her voice strained with frustration. "It's everywhere. The news stations, the blogs, the talk shows. It's like a wildfire. People are already starting to believe it, and we're getting questions from every direction." Clint took a slow breath. "What are we doing about it?" "We're working on a statement. A press release. We'll address the allegations, give some context, but it's going to be tough. The damage is already done." Clint's mind raced as he mulled over her words. This wasn't the first time a story had tried to ruin someone's career. It happened all the time in Hollywood. But this was his life, his reputation on the line. This wasn't just a story. It felt like an attack on who he was as a person. "Clint, you have to understand," Jane continued, her voice softening. "We'll handle it. We've been through worse. But we need you to stay calm. The more you engage with it directly, the more fuel you'll give to the fire." He knew she was right. The public's appetite for drama was insatiable. If he responded rashly or impulsively, it would only feed the narrative. He needed to take a step back, keep his cool, and let Jane and the team handle the situation from a strategic angle. But as Clint sat there, staring at the avalanche of headlines, he couldn't help but feel exposed. His mind wandered back to his early years in the business. How everything had seemed so simple then. If only he had known then what he knew now. "Clint, I'm going to need you to trust me." Jane's voice broke through his reverie. "Stay off social media, don't give any interviews, and let us handle the public response. You've made it through tough times before. This one is no different." Clint nodded even though she couldn't see him. "All right, I trust you, Jane. Just make sure we get ahead of this." "Of course," she replied quickly. "I'll keep you updated." Hanging up the phone, Clint felt a wave of weariness wash over him. He had fought so hard to build a career that meant something. One that mattered, that went beyond the tabloids and gossip. And now, just as he was starting to feel like he could embrace a new version of himself, here it was. The fallout from a past that wasn't quite finished with him yet. Still, he had been in worse situations. He had navigated scandals, dealt with public scrutiny, and faced down enemies both in and outside the courtroom. What was one more battle? He turned his attention to his desk, where his memoir lay open. The draft he had written in the mountains felt so much more authentic to him now. His time away from the chaos had given him a new perspective on how to approach the world, and how to let go of the need to fight every battle. But this was different. This was something that could affect his career, his reputation, his future. Clint knew that he had to respond. Not with anger, but with honesty. He had to show the world the real Clint Eastwood, the one that had grown, evolved, and learned from his mistakes. A few days later, Clint's team finalized the press statement, one that struck a balance between defending his character and addressing the allegations. It wasn't a full-on denial, nor was it an apology. It was a measured, thoughtful response, acknowledging the challenges he had faced but also making it clear that the version of events being sold to the public was an inaccurate, exaggerated portrayal of who he was. As the press release went live, Clint received a call from his attorney, Patrick. "The statement is solid, Clint. It's being picked up by the major outlets, and we're seeing some positive responses. We're not out of the woods yet, but this is a good start." Clint sat back in his chair, the weight of everything slowly sinking in. This wasn't just about defending himself. It was about reclaiming his story. "You know," Clint said thoughtfully, "I've spent so much of my life being someone I thought the world wanted me to be. Maybe now it's time to be the person I want to be." Patrick chuckled. "It's a hell of a time to make that decision, but I think you're right." The next few days passed in a blur. The media storm, while far from over, started to subside as Clint's team worked tirelessly behind the scenes to manage the fallout. The press release had been enough to stem the worst of the tide, but Clint knew it wasn't over. The world's attention span was short, and soon the next big story would come along, shifting focus. Until then, he had to keep his head down and stay the course. But through it all, Clint felt a sense of peace that he hadn't known before. His past, messy as it was, no longer had the power to define him. He was moving forward, not just for the cameras or the public, but for himself. The story was his to tell now, and he would tell it on his own terms. As Clint's press statement continued to make waves, he found himself reflecting more deeply on his relationships, both personal and professional. The fallout from the media storm had been intense, but Clint was beginning to see the silver lining. In the midst of the chaos, he'd started to notice something. People were rallying behind him in ways he hadn't expected. It wasn't just the loyal fans, the ones who had stuck by him throughout the years. It was his colleagues, people he had once considered mere acquaintances or even rivals, now offering their support. Among the most surprising messages Clint received was from one of his most unexpected allies, Sarah Miller, the director he had clashed with on set years ago. Their relationship had been notoriously tumultuous. There were whispers on set that Clint had been difficult to work with, and Sarah was no stranger to the challenges he presented during filming. Their disagreements had often spilled over into public spats, making it clear that their professional relationship was strained, to say the least. But now, Sarah was reaching out to him. Clint sat at his desk, staring at the message she'd sent. The words on the screen were short, but they carried weight. "Clint, I've been following everything that's happening, and I wanted to reach out. I know we've had our differences in the past, but I believe the truth is more complicated than what the media is portraying. You have my support." It was an unexpected gesture, one that Clint hadn't anticipated from someone with whom he had a history of conflict. But there it was, a sign of understanding, of acknowledgement that the narrative being spun by the press didn't tell the full story. After a moment of contemplation, Clint decided to reply. "Thanks, Sarah. I appreciate that more than you know. I guess the truth does have a way of getting lost sometimes." He didn't expect a lengthy conversation to unfold, but Sarah responded almost immediately. "If you ever need someone to talk to, or want to set the record straight about anything, I'm here. Maybe we can finally clear the air." Clint smiled slightly. It was an unexpected olive branch. Over the years, he had grown accustomed to the idea that some conflicts were simply too messy to resolve. But something about Sarah's message felt genuine. Maybe it was time to mend some fences. The next day, Clint found himself on a phone call with Sarah. The conversation was cautious at first, both of them treading lightly around the history they shared. But as they talked, something shifted. They both realized how much they had been shaped by the media's portrayal of their relationship, how it had skewed their own perceptions of one another. Clint had been too proud to admit that his reputation, at times, had been more of a burden than a blessing. And Sarah had been too invested in her own career to see past the public narrative and recognize Clint as a person. As the call continued, they started to talk about more than just the past. They discussed their careers, their personal lives, and even their shared frustrations with the way the entertainment industry operated. For the first time, Clint realized how much they had in common despite their differences. "I've been thinking about what you said in the press release," Sarah said cautiously. About how the truth will always come to light in its own time. You're right, Clint. We can't control how others see us, but we can choose how we react. I respect you for taking the high road. Clint chuckled softly. Not always easy, but it feels right this time. Maybe I've been too focused on keeping up appearances. It's exhausting. The conversation drifted to a more personal tone as they reflected on their lives and what they had learned. Clint realized that in many ways, Sarah's honesty was something he could admire. She had the courage to speak her mind, even if it meant confronting uncomfortable truths. And maybe, just maybe, that was the kind of courage Clint needed to adopt more in his own life. Before they ended the call, Clint couldn't help but say, "Sarah, I'm sorry for the way I acted on set. I didn't make things easy for you, and I didn't respect your vision the way I should have." Sarah's voice softened. "It's in the past, Clint. We were both under pressure. It's not worth holding on to anymore." That conversation marked the beginning of an unexpected friendship. In the weeks that followed, Clint and Sarah found common ground in ways neither of them had expected. They began to work together again, this time with a newfound mutual respect. Sarah became one of his staunchest supporters, often defending him when others in the industry tried to stir the pot. But more than anything, Clint realized how valuable it was to allow himself to be vulnerable, to accept that even the people he had once clashed with could be sources of growth and healing. As Clint settled into this new chapter, another surprising development came into play. A renowned journalist, Michael Grant, who had once been one of his harshest critics, reached out to Clint. Michael had written scathing articles in the past, often questioning Clint's integrity and the authenticity of his public persona. But this time, Michael wasn't interested in dragging Clint through the mud. Instead, he wanted to do something different. An interview. "Clint, I know I've written my fair share of critiques," Michael admitted when they first spoke. "But I've been following your journey recently, and I have to say, I'm impressed by how you've handled everything. I'd like to offer you a platform to share your side of the story on your own terms. No tabloids, no distortions, just the truth, straight from you." Clint was taken aback. It wasn't often that someone from the media came forward with such a direct offer. But Clint was no stranger to the power of a good story, his story. He agreed to the interview, but only under one condition: complete honesty, no fluff, no spin. The interview was set, and it promised to be a turning point, a way for Clint to speak directly to the public and set the record straight once and for all. But it also represented something deeper for Clint, an opportunity to reclaim his voice and, perhaps, reshape his legacy. The day of the interview arrived, and Clint was surprisingly calm. The media circus had been relentless, but he had learned to trust in his own resolve. This wasn't about trying to control the narrative. It was about sharing his story in the way it deserved to be told. He wasn't going to let anyone twist his words or diminish his journey. This time, the truth would come straight from him. Clint sat across from Michael Grant in the studio, a sleek, professional setting. The cameras were rolling, and the crew was busy adjusting their equipment, making final preparations. Clint glanced at the monitor, where he saw himself in the reflection, a man older, wiser, but still undeniably Clint Eastwood. Michael Grant, known for his hard-hitting style, looked a bit different than Clint had expected. He wasn't wearing the usual smirk of a journalist, ready to pounce on his subject. Instead, Michael seemed almost respectful. That alone set the tone for what was to come. "Clint," Michael began as the cameras rolled, "thank you for agreeing to do this. I know you've been through a lot lately, and I know that for someone like you, speaking out like this is rare. Let's start with something simple. How have you been handling everything that's been going on?" Clint took a deep breath, his hands resting on his lap. "You know, Michael, it hasn't been easy. The media has a way of turning everything into a spectacle, and sometimes that's just the way it goes. I've been through worse, though. I've been in this business long enough to know that it's all part of the ride. But what matters now is how we move forward." Michael nodded, clearly intrigued by Clint's calm demeanor. "I can't deny, Clint, I've been one of your harshest critics over the years. I've written my share of pieces questioning your actions, your choices, even your character. But what's striking about you now is that you're not reacting the way I expected. You've taken a step back. You're not lashing out. Why?" Clint leaned forward slightly, his voice steady and measured. Because I've learned something along the way, Michael. I've spent a lot of time chasing after things that didn't matter. I've been driven by ego, by what others thought of me, by the need to prove myself. But I don't have the energy for that anymore. What I've realized is that, in the end, it's not about how the world sees you. It's about how you see yourself. And I've come to terms with who I am. Michael's eyes widened slightly, clearly impressed by Clint's response. That's quite a shift. I think a lot of people in your position might have reacted differently. But you've handled this with grace. Still, I have to ask, why now? Why speak out after all these years of silence? Clint didn't hesitate. Because I'm not running anymore. I've spent too much time in my life trying to escape my past, trying to bury the things I wasn't proud of. But the truth is, we all have a past, and we all make mistakes. The important thing is not to let those mistakes define you. Michael was quiet for a moment, clearly considering Clint's words. Do you feel like your past mistakes have defined you? You've had such a storied career, but it seems like there's always been this tension between the Clint Eastwood people think they know and the person you are. Do you think that tension still exists? Clint exhaled slowly, nodding. I think it's always been there, in one way or another. People see me as this tough guy, the cowboy, the director with an iron will. And sure, that's part of me. But it's only part of me. The truth is, I've always had a lot more going on than what's been shown on screen. I've had my demons, just like anyone else. But that's not the whole story. The interview continued, and Clint began to open up about the personal battles he had fought over the years, the toll of fame, the struggles in his family life, the isolation he sometimes felt despite being surrounded by people. It was a side of Clint Eastwood that few had ever seen, and as he spoke, the hardened persona he had so carefully cultivated over the years began to melt away. Michael seemed to be taken aback by the honesty. It's clear, Clint, that you're not the same person you were when you first started out. You've evolved, and it's not just in terms of your career. You've gone through a lot of personal growth. Can you pinpoint a moment when you realized you needed to change? Clint thought for a moment before responding. There's been a lot of moments, honestly, but I'd say the biggest one came when I took that time off, the time I spent in the mountains. It wasn't just the isolation, though that played a part. It was the silence. It forced me to confront a lot of things I had been avoiding. I had to look at myself honestly, at my mistakes, my flaws, the things I had never been willing to face. And once I did that, everything started to make sense. I realized that I didn't need to be the person everyone expected me to be. I just needed to be myself. Michael leaned back, clearly moved by Clint's words. It sounds like that time was a turning point for you. And now, even in the face of all the media turmoil, you're still holding on to that sense of clarity. Clint nodded. Yeah, I'm not going to pretend that everything is perfect now. I still have my moments of doubt, just like anyone else. But I know who I am now. And that's something I can hold on to, no matter what the world throws at me. The interview concluded with a final question from Michael. Clint, what's next for you? What do you hope people take away from all of this? Clint smiled, a rare, genuine smile that reached his eyes. I just hope they see the real me, not the character on screen, not the persona that's been built up over the years. I hope they see the person who has made mistakes, learned from them, and kept going. And maybe, in the process, they can take something from that. We all have our own journeys, our own struggles. But the important thing is to keep moving forward. As the cameras turned off and the crew began to pack up, Clint felt a weight lift off his shoulders. For the first time in years, he felt like he had truly spoken his truth. And no matter what happened next, he knew he had done the right thing. The aftermath of Clint's interview sent ripples through the media landscape. The world had seen him in a way they never had before. Vulnerable, honest, and unapologetic about his past. It wasn't just his fans who noticed the shift. Even his harshest critics couldn't deny that Clint had earned their respect. The narrative surrounding him had slowly begun to change. People weren't just seeing Clint Eastwood as the legendary actor and director. They were starting to understand him as a person. Clint had known the interview would spark a response, but he hadn't anticipated how far-reaching it would be. Within days, his inbox was flooded with messages from all walks of life. Fans, fellow actors, journalists, and even people who had once been his adversaries. Many of them thanked him for his honesty, for shedding light on the pressures and struggles that came with his fame. Some said they felt a new sense of admiration for him, while others expressed gratitude for his vulnerability, seeing it as a reminder that no one is invincible. Yet, not everyone was on board. There were still those who clung to the old narrative, the tough, unyielding Clint Eastwood, the one who had been cast in the role of the stoic, unbreakable man. They criticized him for showing weakness, for letting down his guard after years of carefully crafting an image. But Clint didn't mind. He had already reconciled with the fact that not everyone would accept the change. It was more important that he had come to terms with it. As Clint sat in his home office, reading through the messages, he found himself reflecting on how far he had come. The journey that had once seemed so daunting, filled with the need for constant approval, the weight of public opinion, had led him to this moment of clarity. For the first time in his life, Clint felt free from the shackles of others' expectations. That was when the phone rang. It was a call he had been waiting for but had never quite known how to prepare for. "Clint, it's Michael Grant," the voice on the other end said, a note of excitement in his tone. "I just got the latest numbers. Your interview is the most watched segment we've ever aired, and the response has been overwhelmingly positive. There's a groundswell of support for you right now. People are finally seeing the real Clint Eastwood." Clint's heart skipped a beat. It wasn't just the validation he had expected, but something deeper. It was proof that the world was ready to embrace a more nuanced version of who he was. "That's good to hear," Clint replied, his voice steady. "I just hope it makes people think, that's all." Michael chuckled. "Oh, it's definitely making people think. And it's not just your fans, it's industry insiders too. You've got people talking, Clint, and that means something." As the call continued, Clint realized just how much his life had shifted in such a short time. This moment of public recognition felt less about celebrity status and more about the connection he had forged with others. It was no longer about pleasing the masses. It was about finding peace with himself. Later that day, Clint went for a walk around his property. The sun was beginning to set, casting a warm, golden light over the landscape. It was a peaceful moment, one of those rare times when the noise of the world seemed to fade into the background. Clint let out a long sigh, allowing himself to soak in the serenity. In the distance, he saw his daughter, Allison, sitting on the porch with a cup of coffee, looking out over the horizon. He had always valued the time he spent with her, especially after everything that had happened in his personal life. She had been one of the few constants in his world, and their relationship had deepened over the years as they had both grown. Clint walked up to her and sat down beside her, the two of them in comfortable silence for a moment. Finally, Allison spoke, her voice soft but filled with sincerity. "I watched your interview, Dad. I'm proud of you." Clint looked over at her, feeling a warmth spread through him. "Thanks, kid. That means a lot." Allison smiled. "I know it's been a tough road, but I've always believed in you. You've always had this strength, this quiet resolve. And now, I think people are finally starting to see it. It's not about being perfect. It's about being real. And you've been real with everyone." Clint felt his throat tighten at her words. He had worked so hard to protect her from the scrutiny he had faced, wanting to shield her from the harsh realities of fame. But in that moment, he realized that his daughter had seen the real him all along. She hadn't needed the facade. She had always known the man behind the legend. "I've made my share of mistakes, Allison," Clint said quietly, "but I'm doing my best to make things right. Not just with everyone else, but with myself." "I know," she replied gently, "and I think that's the most important thing. You don't need to prove anything to anyone anymore, Dad. You've done enough." The two of them sat in companionable silence for a while longer, the sun sinking lower in the sky. It was a moment of peace, of understanding. Clint realized that no matter how much the world might change, there would always be moments like this. Moments that reminded him of what truly mattered. In the days that followed, Clint found himself reflecting on his journey. The world was watching him in a new light, but he knew that the real test lay ahead. How he would continue to live his truth in a world that often demanded the opposite. But for now, Clint was content. He had faced his past, reconciled with it, and had finally found the courage to move forward. As he walked back inside, Clint glanced at the news headlines on his phone. There was still plenty of noise out there. The media would always have something to say. But Clint no longer cared. He had reclaimed his voice, and no one could take that away from him. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough?